Returning home unexpectedly early, I discovered my husband lounging in our master bathtub alongside my younger sister. Without a second thought, I locked the heavy oak door from the hallway and immediately dialed my brother-in-law, telling him, "You need to get over here right this second." 15 minutes later, he arrived, but he didn't come alone. My name is Arya. At 34 years old, I never envisioned I would find myself standing on the wrong side of a locked door in my own mansion, listening to my entire personal life unravel. I had always been the dependable one, the planner, the problem solver, while my younger sister, Brianna, was the family's golden child who could seemingly do no wrong. I had meticulously built a lucrative career as a creative director and purchased this stunning estate in Seattle, while Brianna coasted through life, heavily relying on her superficial charm and our parents' bank accounts. Today, however, that lifelong dynamic was about to permanently shift. It was exactly 2:14 on a Tuesday afternoon. I was originally scheduled to be on a flight to Chicago for a major client pitch, but an unexpected mechanical failure grounded the aircraft. Exhausted, I decided to head back home to surprise my husband, Gavin. I purposely didn't text him. I just wanted to curl up on the living room sofa with him and disconnect from the corporate world. When I stepped into the grand foyer, the house was draped in an unusual, heavy silence. I slipped off my designer heels on the cold marble floor, and that was when I heard it, the faint, rhythmic splashing of water and the low, mechanical hum of the jacuzzi jets echoing from the master suite upstairs. I frowned. Gavin had explicitly told me he was bogged down with back-to-back virtual meetings all day. I ascended the floating glass staircase, my stockinged feet completely silent against the steps. As I approached the bedroom corridor, the noises grew distinctly recognizable. There was laughter, a very specific, high-pitched giggling that I had recognized my entire life. It was Brianna. My stomach plummeted into a bottomless abyss, yet my brain stubbornly refused to process it. Maybe she just dropped by for a visit, I rationalized. Maybe she's watching TV in the guest room and the sound is echoing. But as I reached the threshold of the open master bedroom door, the chaotic trail of discarded garments completely shattered my denial. My husband's expensive silk tie was carelessly draped over a velvet armchair. My sister's vibrant red cocktail dress lay crumpled in a heap on the hardwood floor. The ensuite bathroom door was cracked open just an inch, allowing thick clouds of lavender-scented steam to escape into the bedroom. I crept closer, instinctively holding my breath, and peered through the narrow gap. The visual burned itself into my retinas with searing permanence. Gavin was submerged in the bubbling tub, and Brianna was sitting comfortably across from him. They were casually sipping my vintage, top-tier champagne. Gavin was chuckling at a joke she made, affectionately tracing his index finger down the curve of her wet arm. The sheer intimacy of the moment was undeniable. They looked incredibly relaxed, as if this was a frequent routine rather than a sudden, shameful mistake. In that agonizing fraction of a second, I could have screamed until my lungs gave out. I could have violently kicked the door off its hinges and shattered a glass vase against the wall. But instead, an unnatural, glacial calmness flooded my veins. I am a seasoned businesswoman. I do not react with reckless emotion. I strategize. I slowly pulled the heavy oak door toward me. It shut with a soft, barely audible click. They were completely deaf to it over the roaring noise of the jacuzzi jets. I reached into my leather tote and extracted my heavy key ring. Gavin used to constantly mock me for carrying the master skeleton key that could secure every single interior door in our massive home. He affectionately dubbed it my control freak quirk. Today, however, it was my greatest weapon. I slid the old-fashioned brass key into the deadbolt on the exterior side of the bathroom door. I turned it once. Click. I turned it twice. Click. The lock engaged solidly. They were officially trapped inside my ensuite bathroom, entirely naked and blissfully oblivious to their impending doom. Before I continue this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. I leaned my spine against the solid wood, listening to the churning water. I took a deep, centering breath and retrieved my smartphone. I didn't dial the authorities just yet. Instead, I called Declan, my brother-in-law, Brianna's husband. He answered on the second ring. "Declan," I stated, deliberately keeping my tone terrifyingly flat. "You need to come to my house immediately." WH. Why, what's going on? He asked, instantly picking up on the freezing edge in my voice. Because I have a package here that rightfully belongs to you, I whispered coldly. And make sure you bring the red envelope. He didn't waste time asking follow-up questions. He simply hung up the phone. I glanced down at my wristwatch. The ultimate show was about to commence. The oblivious peace inside the bathroom lasted exactly 3 more minutes before the brass handle rattled violently. It was the frantic, desperate noise of metal aggressively grinding against a highly secure deadbolt. Gavin shouted my name, his voice muffled by the thick oak barrier, but the rising panic in his tone was crystal clear. Arya, open this door right now. This isn't funny. The playful splashing of the water stopped abruptly, swiftly replaced by the wet, frantic slapping of bare feet against the porcelain tile. I didn't utter a single word in response. I simply leaned my full body weight against the doorframe, tightly crossing my arms over my chest. I could actually feel the vibrations traveling up my spine as he pounded his heavy fists against the wood. It was a rhythmic asterisk thud, thud, thud that perfectly synchronized with the beating of my own heart, not out of panic or fear, but out of a bizarre, ice-cold rush of adrenaline. Brianna's voice suddenly joined his, shrill, entitled, and highly demanding. Let me out of here, you psycho. My clothes are out there. You cannot legally keep us locked in here. I closed my eyes and allowed a tiny, humorless smirk to grace my lips. Merely 24 hours ago, Gavin had sweetly kissed my forehead at the front door, his designer luggage packed with heavy winter coats. He had looked deeply into my eyes and murmured, Chicago is absolutely freezing this time of year. I'm going to miss you so much, honey. At that exact same hour, Brianna had uploaded a selfie to our family group, chat featuring a glass of cucumber water with the caption, Spa day vibes, self-care desperately needed. Lies. Just endless layers upon layers of cheap, predictable, and lazy lies. They genuinely believed they were so incredibly clever, coordinating their little alibis, assuming I was far too absorbed in closing corporate mergers to notice the glaring inconsistencies in their timelines. But they stupidly forgot that my entire career revolves around noticing the microscopic details that everyone else overlooks. The pounding against the door intensified to a fever pitch. I slipped my phone out of my blazer pocket, my thumb hovering over the bright screen. The wallpaper was still a romantic candid of Gavin and me from our luxurious anniversary trip to Napa Valley. Without a second of hesitation, I permanently swiped it away. I opened my text thread with Declan. We hadn't conversed much recently beyond polite, superficial nods at holiday dinners, but I fundamentally knew he was the only other individual in this entire family who prioritized deep loyalty over keeping up fake appearances. I rapidly typed out a message. Come to my house immediately. Do not ask any questions. Then I sent a follow-up line. Bring the red package. I hit send and watched the delivered status shift to read almost instantaneously. Declan was a highly successful architect. He was meticulous, flawlessly punctual, and he knew exactly what that red package held. It was a legal fail-safe we had half-jokingly discussed over glasses of expensive scotch during a Christmas party 2 years ago. Neither of us truly believed we would ever have to deploy it. Back inside the steamy bathroom, their aggression began shifting into desperate bargaining. Gavin's voice dropped a full octave, attempting to project a sense of logical reason. Baby, please, come on. It is absolutely not what it looks like. We were just chatting. I accidentally slipped in the tub and Brianna was just helping me stand up. Please, just unlock the deadbolt and we can calmly explain everything. Explain. That was incredibly rich. I took a deliberate step away from the locked door, allowing the sharp heels of my shoes to click loudly against the hardwood floor so they would undeniably know I was still standing there, absorbing every pathetic excuse. I casually strolled over to the expensive mahogany nightstand where Gavin showcased his prized watch collection. I picked up his absolute favorite Rolex, the gold one I had purchased for him when he received his honorary title promotion. I slowly turned it over in my palm, feeling the heavy, expensive weight of the gold. You have exactly 15 minutes, Gavin, I announced, projecting my voice loud enough to easily penetrate the oak, yet keeping my tone perfectly steady. I highly suggest you use that time to fabricate a far better lie than slipping in the tub. And Brianna, I really hope you're enjoying the steam. I hear it works wonders for your pores. I casually exited the master bedroom and positioned myself at the top of the gra. ND staircase, gazing down into the expansive foyer. My estate had truly never looked more breathtaking. The late afternoon sunlight filtered gorgeously through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating tiny dust motes that danced gracefully in the air. It was remarkably serene out here, yet behind that secured bedroom door, I had just declared a brutal war. And unlike my cheating husband and sister, I had shown up with heavy legal ammunition. Gavin's negotiation tactics morphed with terrifying velocity. The aggressive, thumping fists ceased, quickly replaced by a soft, almost polite rapping of knuckles against the wood. When he finally spoke again, his tone dripped with that nauseatingly condescending calmness he always deployed whenever I dared to question his reckless credit card spending. "Arya, baby, I need you to please listen to reason," he coaxed. "You are blowing this entirely out of proportion." Brianna was feeling faint. She has been having those severe dizzy spells lately, remember? She almost completely collapsed on the hard tile. I was merely helping her ease into the water so she could cool her body down. I didn't want her to pass out and crack her skull open. It was an excuse so remarkably lazy it bordered on insulting. He was actively attempting to gaslight me through 3 inches of solid oak. He actually expected my intelligent brain to accept that the standard medical remedy for a fainting spell involved stripping entirely naked and guzzling vintage champagne. He was heavily banking on my long-standing history of being the family fixer, the person who perpetually smoothed over conflicts to prevent public scenes. But the version of Arya who fixed things had instantly died the exact second I witnessed his hand caressing her arm. Brianna, on the other hand, lacked the mental endurance for a long con. She was completely finished with pretending. Her shrill voice sliced through Gavin's soothing, manipulative tone like a jagged, serrated knife. "Oh, just shut up, Gavin," she screeched. "Stop trying to coddle her feelings. She doesn't even have any." I could distinctly hear her shuffling closer to the door. I could vividly picture her pressing her flushed face against the wood, her damp hair dripping puddles onto my expensive floors. "You really want to know the harsh truth, Arya?" she bellowed. "Fine, here it is. You are a miserable ice queen. You treat this entire marriage like a corporate merger and acquisition. You are literally never home. You're perpetually jetting off to some pretentious client dinner while Gavin sits around this giant house all by himself. He desperately needed a real, warm woman. Someone who actually understands how to prioritize a loving husband over a boring quarterly financial report. You drove him straight into my arms. This is entirely your own fault." Her vicious words were precisely engineered to shatter me. She zeroed in on my deepest, most private insecurity, the nagging fear that my fierce ambitions somehow rendered me fundamentally unlovable. But instead of breaking down into tears, I experienced a massive, electrifying surge of cold, untouchable power. She was verbally admitting to everything. She was actively justifying the ultimate betrayal of her own flesh and blood simply because she coveted what belonged to me. She was no tragic victim of circumstances. She was a calculated predator. I didn't bother screaming back at her. I didn't waste my breath justifying the demanding career that generously paid for the luxurious roof over their heads and the very heated water they were currently soaking in. Engaging in a screaming match would only grant them the twisted satisfaction of knowing they had pierced my armor. Instead, I calmly strolled over to the centralized smart home control panel, seamlessly mounted on the wall near the staircase. It was a state-of-the-art interface that digitally linked every single room on the property. I gracefully tapped the glowing touchscreen. I selected the audio input source as the asterisk, master bedroom intercom. Then, I deliberately selected the output broadcasting zone as asterisk whole house. Finally, I cranked the digital volume dial all the way up to its absolute maximum. Instantaneously, the hidden surround sound speakers in the grand foyer, the gourmet kitchen, the formal living room, and even the basement media theater crackled to life. Brianna's venomous voice was no longer muffled behind a heavy door. It was now booming down from the high ceilings like a wrathful deity of betrayal. "You are so pathetic, Arya." Her artificially amplified voice thundered throughout the massive estate, physically vibrating the crystal chandelier hanging in the main hallway. "Gavin has been completely miserable for years. He literally told me he only stayed married to you because of your bank accounts." I stood motionless in the hallway, peacefully listening to her publicly annihilate her own character. Every single toxic syllable was being loudly broadcast to the main floor, precisely where my private cleaning staff would be arriving to begin their evening shift in less than 10 minutes. I deeply wanted every square inch of this sprawling estate to thoroughly absorb their toxic betrayal, so that when I finally booted them out, the environment would finally be sanitized. "Keep right on talking, Brianna," I murmured to myself with a dark smile. "Keep digging that grave a little deeper." I gracefully descended the floating staircase, entirely abandoning the chaotic screaming upstairs. Brianna's amplified voice continued echoing through the expensive speakers, aggressively ranting about how I was a catastrophic sister and a hopelessly defective wife. But down here in the expansive, marble-clad kitchen, her tantrums faded into mere background noise. It honestly sounded like a desperate, low-budget podcast I had absolutely zero interest in subscribing to. I reached for an unopened bottle of premium Cabernet resting on the granite kitchen island. It was a highly exclusive vintage Gavin had purchased for our 5-year wedding anniversary. He had delivered a sickeningly sweet toast that evening about our shared future, about constructing a beautiful legacy together. I forcefully popped the cork with a deeply satisfying thwack and poured myself an incredibly generous glass. I held the delicate crystal up to the ambient light, mesmerized as the deep, blood-red liquid swirled. I concluded that the fiery destruction of a fraudulent marriage was definitely a special enough occasion to pop open the top-tier wine. As I took my first rich sip, the initial spike of adrenaline began to ebb, and a profound, terrifying clarity swiftly took its place. The honest truth was, I hadn't been totally blind to his actions. I had merely been quietly waiting. Exactly 6 months prior, I had detected the very first glaring discrepancy in our joint checking account. It was a relatively minor charge, just a dinner for two at an upscale steakhouse on a random Tuesday when Gavin swore he was pulling late hours at the office. Following that were the unexplained cash withdrawals. $500 here, $1,000 there. He constantly labeled them as client entertainment in our shared budgeting app. But I was intimately familiar with Gavin's corporate clients. They were obsessed health nuts who strictly drank organic green juice, not top-shelf scotch, and they most certainly did not frequent the luxury lingerie boutique where a highly suspicious $2,000 charge suddenly appeared last November. I distinctly recalled questioning him about that specific transaction. He had stared me dead in the eyes, without a single blink, and smoothly claimed he had purchased a lavish gift for his mother's milestone birthday. I strategically called his mother later that exact same week under the guise of wishing her a happy birthday. She innocently informed me that Gavin had sent her a simple greeting card, just a cheap paper card. That was the exact split second the romantic love had died. That was the moment I officially ceased being a trusting, loving wife and actively morphed into a relentless forensic accountant. I deliberately chose not to confront him back then because I lacked the undeniable smoking gun. I required irrefutable, undeniable proof. I desperately needed to catch them in a scenario that left absolutely zero room for their manipulative gaslighting, no wiggle room for their pathetic excuses, and unequivocally no legal avenue for them to successfully claim half of my hard-earned assets in a brutal divorce settlement. I gently swirled the dark wine in my glass once more. Today, I finally secured my undeniable proof. Yet, it was vastly uglier than my worst nightmares had conjured. I had mentally prepared myself to discover it was his young secretary or perhaps a lingering college flame. I stubbornly refused to let my brain entertain the horrifying thought that it would be Brianna, my own flesh and blood, the sister whose expensive college tuition I had fully funded, the sister whose trembling hand I had held tightly when she was a child getting her tonsils removed. This profound betrayal didn't shatter my heart, it calcified it. It instantly transmuted my deep sadness into a freezing, incredibly heavy stone sitting at the very bottom of my stomach. Suddenly, the sharp, melodic chime of the front doorbell sliced through the house, momentarily overriding the screeching echoing from the overhead speakers. I carefully placed my crystal wine glass down on a marble coaster. I quickly inspected my reflection in the darkened windowpane. My red lipstick remained absolutely flawless. My tailored blazer was perfectly unwrinkled. I did not look like a broken, sobbing victim. I looked precisely like the ruthless CEO of my own existence. I strode purposefully to the grand front entrance. Through the heavy frosted glass panels, I could easily make out the imposing silhouette of a Tall, remarkably broad-shouldered man. Flanking him on either side were two distinct, uniformed shapes. My requested reinforcements had officially arrived. I unbolted the door and pulled it wide open. Declan stood perfectly upright on my porch, looking utterly impeccable in his tailored charcoal suit, but his dark eyes burned with an intense, quiet fury he was barely managing to contain. I gracefully stepped aside and gestured for the trio to enter my home. "Welcome to the event," I stated with absolute dry sarcasm. "The primary entertainment is trapped upstairs, and they are absolutely dying for an audience." Declan didn't offer a polite smile. He merely gave a firm nod to the two police officers and stepped confidently across the threshold, tightly gripping a thick red envelope that literally contained the legal power to detonate Gavin's cushy life as he knew it. Declan didn't utter a single word as he moved into the grand foyer. He truly didn't need to. His sheer physical presence effortlessly commanded the massive space in a way Gavin's fragile ego never possibly could. Accompanying Declan were two fully uniformed Seattle police officers looking incredibly stern and official, alongside Ms. Palmer, my family's fiercely loyal estate attorney who had previously served my late grandmother for over 30 years. She sharply adjusted her designer glasses and offered me a highly professional, curt nod of acknowledgement. "Arya," Ms. Palmer announced, her tone razor-crisp and entirely businesslike, "we have arrived with the exact legal documents you urgently requested. The property deed, the full trust agreement, and the emergency restraining order application." I casually gestured up toward the grand staircase where Brianna's amplified voice was still shrieking from the hidden speakers, although her tone had noticeably deteriorated into a hoarse, repetitive wail. "The trespassers are located upstairs," I clarified. "In the master suite." One of the police officers, a remarkably tall man sporting a tight buzzcut, shifted his gaze toward Declan. "Sir, are you the legal owner of this property?" Declan firmly shook his head and immediately pointed directly at me. "No, officer. My sister-in-law here is the sole legal owner of this estate. I am merely acting as a witness today, but I do possess signed authorization to act directly on her behalf regarding all home security matters." Declan smoothly withdrew a neatly folded, thick document from his interior jacket pocket and handed it directly to the tall officer. It was a fully notarized, legally binding copy of the property deed, undeniably stating that the home's ownership fell entirely under the A and D family trust. The officer rapidly scanned the dense legal text, visibly verifying the details, before looking back up at me. "Ma'am, to be clear, do you want these specific individuals physically removed from your private property?" I locked eyes with him, my expression unyielding. "I want them permanently removed. I want them criminally prosecuted for trespassing, and I demand a full official police report be filed immediately. They have stubbornly refused to leave the premises after being explicitly asked multiple times." "Understood clearly, ma'am," the officer replied. He gave a quick tactical signal to his partner. "Let's move out." We ascended the floating glass staircase as a unified, intimidating front. The collective sound of our heavy footsteps created a rhythmic, terrifying march of impending judgment. As we finally reached the upper landing, Brianna's screeching voice cut out entirely. She must have finally detected the heavy, authoritative thud of police boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The sudden, suffocating silence that instantly followed was honestly far more chilling than her unhinged screaming. Declan walked rigidly beside me, his facial expression entirely unreadable and carved from stone. I profoundly understood the massive emotional toll this exact moment was costing him. He had genuinely loved Brianna once. He had lovingly built her a custom art studio. He had patiently tolerated her endless, childish tantrums. But ultimate betrayal possesses a unique way of rapidly erasing all fond history. Today, he was absolutely not a devoted husband rushing in to rescue his distressed wife. He was an architect coldly arriving to inspect a scheduled demolition. We halted directly outside the master bedroom door. The absolute silence emanating from inside was thick and suffocating. They absolutely knew someone was standing out in the hallway, but they possessed zero clue as to who. They were likely anticipating Gavin's overbearing mother to show up, or perhaps predicting that I was simply returning to wave a white flag and surrender. "Open it," Declan commanded softly. I reached for the brass skeleton key that remained securely lodged in the lock. My hand did not tremble even a fraction of an inch. I deliberately turned the heavy deadbolt backward. CL. Ick, click. I forcefully pushed the heavy oak door wide open. The thick steam had largely dissipated, leaving the massive bathroom feeling damp and smelling overwhelmingly of my expensive, imported eucalyptus bath salts. Gavin and Brianna stood awkwardly frozen in the very center of the room, physically shivering. They were dripping wet, desperately clutching my plush, white Egyptian cotton towels around their bodies like incredibly pathetic, oversized togas. Their eyes bulged to comical proportions when they fully registered the imposing wall of authorities standing in the hallway. Gavin's smug face instantly drained to a ghastly, translucent shade of pale the exact second he spotted the shiny police badges. Brianna merely stared blankly at Declan, her jaw dropping open and snapping, closed repeatedly like a suffocating fish yanked out of the water. "Honey," she whimpered, her voice quivering violently. "What? What are you doing here?" Declan flatly refused to answer her. He simply stepped to the side, allowing the two uniformed officers to fully breach the room. Simultaneously, the harsh, blinding flash of a digital camera illuminated the space. Ms. Palmer was already meticulously at work, expertly documenting the scandalous scene for the impending courtroom battle. The heavy oak door swung fully inward, fully exposing the humid sanctuary that had officially been transformed into an active crime scene of marital betrayal. The residual steam billowing out carried the scent of lavender, a fragrance I had once deeply associated with ultimate relaxation, but would now permanently link to disgusting deceit. The visual scene unfolding before us was pathetic in its sheer clarity. Gavin and Brianna were awkwardly scrambling away from the edge of the porcelain tub, using my premium white towels as flimsy shields to cover their wet, trembling skin. The heated water was still aggressively churning inside the jacuzzi, providing a bizarre, bubbling soundtrack to their absolute public humiliation. Ms. Palmer bravely stepped forward before anyone else could utter a word. She was a fierce, uncompromising woman in her early 60s, possessing a spine forged from solid steel, and she raised her digital camera with the cold precision of a military sniper. Click, click, click. The bright flashes were utterly blinding against the dim, romantic mood lighting of the bathroom, flawlessly illuminating every single damning detail of their gross infidelity. The camera captured the $300 champagne bottle resting precariously on the tub's edge, the two half-empty crystal flutes, the pathetic way Brianna's soaked hair was plastered messily across her face, and the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from Gavin's wide eyes as he finally realized his incredibly comfortable life was rapidly unraveling, frame by agonizing frame. "Stop it!" Gavin shrieked, frantically throwing a wet hand up to block the camera lens. "You absolutely cannot do this. This is highly illegal. Get that damn camera out of my face right now." Ms. Palmer lowered the device slightly, but firmly refused to cease her recording. "Actually, Gavin, it is perfectly within the bounds of the law," she stated with icy calmness. "This is a private residence solely owned by my client. You are currently engaging in explicit adulterous behavior, which directly and undeniably violates the strict morality clause deeply embedded in your signed prenuptial agreement. These digital images are simply necessary, legal documentation for the highly imminent divorce proceedings. So, smile." Brianna desperately looked past the intimidating lawyer and successfully locked eyes with Declan. I heavily expected her to instantly burst into dramatic tears or fall to her knees begging for his forgiveness. I genuinely expected her to rush toward him, but instead, she just froze like a deer in headlights. She finally noticed the two armed police officers standing directly behind him, their hands resting casually but dangerously near their utility belts, and the massive gravity of the horrifying situation finally crashed down upon her. "Declan," she whimpered, her tiny voice barely audible over the mechanical hum of the jacuzzi jets. "Declan, please, just let me explain everything." Declan refused to step a single inch into the humid room. He remained planted in the doorway like an immovable stone statue, towering menacingly over the pathetic scene. He stared at his wife of 3 long years, who was standing entirely naked next to her older sister's husband, and his facial expression remained terrifyingly blank. There was zero visible rage. There was absolutely no evident heartbreak. It was exclusively the hollow look of a man who had already deeply grieved the permanent death of his marriage long before he ever walked into this house. "Save your breath, Brianna," Declan stated. His voice was incredibly deep, totally steady, and completely devoid of any remaining warmth. I read all the deleted XD messages. I reviewed the hidden hotel receipts from last month. I simply needed to witness this exact scene with my own 2 eyes to confirm I wasn't going crazy. He slowly shifted his gaze toward Gavin, looking at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. You 2 trash bags truly deserve each other. The thick blanket of shame suffocating the room was entirely palpable. Gavin, however, pathetically attempted to muster some remaining shred of patriarchal authority, foolishly puffing out his wet chest despite being wrapped tightly in a bath towel. You actually brought the cops into this, he spat venomously, glaring directly at me. You really are a cold-hearted, miserable witch, Arya. We were merely in here comforting each other because you are so damn emotionally unavailable. I actually laughed out loud. It was a sharp, incredibly dry sound that easily sliced right through the thick humidity. Comforting each other, you say, I repeated mockingly. Is that what they're calling it these days? I sharply turned to the waiting officers. Officers, I would like these 2 unauthorized individuals physically removed from my private property immediately. They do not reside here, and their continued presence is causing me severe emotional distress. Gavin's jaw practically unhinged. You can't just kick me out. I live here. This is my damn house, too. I shook my head very slowly, deeply savoring every microsecond of the moment. No, Gavin, you merely sleep here, and as of this exact moment, your generous lease has officially expired. The rapid transformation from a cowering, caught adulterer into a loud, self-righteous victim took Gavin exactly 30 seconds. He frantically scrambled into his wrinkled dress trousers, absurdly hopping around on one bare foot while continuously shouting arrogant orders. He completely failed to button his dress shirt properly before aggressively redirecting his misplaced anger toward the armed officers. Officer, I formally demand that you arrest this insane woman immediately, he bellowed, aggressively pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my face. She intentionally locked us inside this bathroom against our free will. That is textbook false imprisonment. That is literally kidnapping. I completely know my legal rights. It was an incredibly bold, yet deeply stupid strategy. He was actively attempting to pivot the main narrative entirely away from his gross infidelity and refocus it onto my calculated reaction. He desperately wanted to make the locked deadbolt on the door the primary crime, rather than the disgusting betrayal that occurred behind it. He stared at the police officers with wide, pleading eyes, heavily channeling every single ounce of his manipulative charm that had sadly once fooled me. You guys have to understand, my wife is seriously not well mentally, Gavin pleaded smoothly. She has been under a massive amount of corporate stress at work lately. She is highly delusional. She literally sees things that aren't actually there. I stood calmly beside Miss Palmer and silently watched him perform his desperate monologue. It was genuinely fascinating in a highly grotesque, pitiful sort of way. He was actively attempting to construct an alternate reality right in front of us, a reality where he was the purely innocent, devoted husband tenderly caring for his sick sister-in-law, and I was the completely deranged, psychotic, jealous wife who merely hallucinated an affair. Gavin relentlessly continued his unhinged tirade, foolishly stepping much closer to the taller police officer. She has been clinically paranoid for months now. She constantly accuses me of sleeping with absolutely everyone. The local barista, the neighbor down the street, and now her own blood sister. It is genuinely sick. We were only sitting in here because Brianna felt incredibly faint and urgently needed cool water. Arya maliciously locked the door and aggressively refused to let us out. We were absolutely terrified. She is highly dangerous. You need to legally take her into custody right now for an involuntary psychiatric evaluation. Brianna, sensing an escape route, caught onto his lie remarkably quickly. She hastily wrapped a luxurious silk robe around her wet body and let out a dramatic, quivering sob that sounded incredibly rehearsed. He is absolutely right. She sniffled loudly, dramatically wiping away a completely fake, invisible tear. Arya has always been incredibly jealous of me. He has perpetually wanted everything I have. She deliberately locked us in this room just to torture and humiliate us. I was genuinely scared for my very life, officer. I truly thought she was going to pour gasoline and burn the whole house down. The seasoned officer slowly looked from Gavin's sweating face to Brianna's fake tears, and then calmly looked back at me. His stoic expression did not shift a millimeter. He had likely responded to hundreds of messy domestic disputes throughout his car. And he intimately knew the distinct, foul stench of a desperate lie. He looked pointedly at the heavy brass deadbolt on the door and then glanced down at his official notepad. "Sir, let me just ensure I have this story straight," the officer drawled. "You are actively claiming that your wife forcefully imprisoned you. Yet you're currently standing inside a luxurious master bathroom featuring an active jacuzzi tub, multiple half-empty vintage champagne glasses, and both of your clothing items are chaotically scattered across the floor. And you seriously want me to arrest the legal homeowner for locking a door inside her own private residence?" Gavin violently sputtered, his entire face turning a deep, blotchy red. "It absolutely does not matter what it looks like. The law is the law." She illegally restricted my physical movement. I finally decided to speak, my voice effortlessly slicing through his pathetic hysteria like a sharpened razor blade. "Gavin, you are completely free to move around now. In fact, I am highly encouraging you to move yourself right out the front door." Gavin fiercely sneered at me, completely dropping his fragile victim act for a split second. "I am not going anywhere, Arya. This is my house. You absolutely cannot legally kick me out just because you are experiencing a psychotic break. Officer, please tell this crazy woman she cannot legally evict me from my own marital home." He aggressively crossed his arms in a triumphant stance, entirely convinced that state residency laws securely protected him. He genuinely believed that simply because he received his Amazon packages here and slept in my expensive bed, he somehow possessed ironclad squatter's rights. He was rapidly about to learn a highly painful, incredibly expensive legal lesson regarding the massive difference between being a legal husband and being a mere tenant. Meanwhile, Brianna watched her husband step fully into the bathroom, and her facial expression drastically shifted from raw fear to a very strange, twisted sort of anticipation. She intimately knew Declan was a highly passionate, emotional man. In her deeply broken mind, she likely fully expected him to violently lunge at Gavin, to throw a devastating punch, to scream at the top of his lungs until his voice gave out. She actively expected a fiery crime of passion because, in her extremely toxic worldview, male jealousy was the ultimate, supreme form of flattery. She tightly adjusted the silk robe around her chest and took a slow, tentative step toward him, her large eyes welling up with a fresh batch of fake tears, fully preparing to play the classic role of the deeply confused, overwhelmed wife who simply made a terrible, one-time mistake. "Declan, honey, please, just say something," she whimpered, dramatically reaching a trembling, wet hand out toward him. "I was just so incredibly lonely. Gavin was simply the only one listening to me." "We honestly didn't mean for any of this to happen." Declan did not even flinch. He wholly refused to look at her outstretched hand. He also refused to look at Gavin, who was still ridiculously puffing his chest out by the double sinks. Instead, Declan simply reached into the deep inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. The movement was incredibly slow, methodical, and deliberate. Brianna violently flinched backwards, genuinely expecting him to pull out a loaded weapon. In a legal sense, it absolutely was a weapon. He slowly pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was notably not the red envelope I had previously instructed him to bring. That specific one was being saved for later. This envelope was deeply personal. He extended his long arm and held it out directly to her. His hand was completely steady, rock solid. "What? What is this?" Brianna asked, her voice cracking into a tiny whisper. "Just take it," Declan commanded. His tone wasn't fueled by burning anger. It was fueled by pure, absolute exhaustion. She hesitantly reached out and accepted the thick envelope. Her damp, trembling fingers left dark, wet marks on the brown paper. She slowly lifted the flap and pulled out the crisp, legally binding document hidden inside. The bold, black, capitalized letters printed at the very top were clearly visible even from where I was standing in the hallway. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." Brianna loudly gasped, immediately dropping the heavy papers onto the wet porcelain tile. "You're divorcing me," she shrieked, staring up at him with unadulterated disbelief. "Over one single mistake. Declan, we can fix this. We can easily go to couples counseling. You absolutely cannot just casually throw away 3 entire years of our marriage because of one stupid misunderstanding." Declan let out a short, incredibly bitter, hollow laugh. "One mistake," he repeated mockingly, slowly shaking his head. Brianna, please do not insult my basic intelligence. Do not stand there wrapped in your older sister's towel and attempt to lie straight to my face one last time. He took a large, intimidating step closer, towering ominously over her shrinking frame. I secretly installed a hidden GPS tracker on the undercarriage of your Range Rover exactly 6 weeks ago, he revealed coldly. I did it the very day you came home smelling overwhelmingly of Gavin's distinct cologne and tried to tell me you had been sweating at hot yoga. Brianna's entire face went deathly white. Gavin instantly stopped his ridiculous posturing and heavily slumped against the granite counter, finally realizing the catastrophic depth of the massive hole they had dug for themselves. I know all about the cheap Motel 6 located right off the interstate, Declan relentlessly continued, aggressively ticking the secret locations off on his fingers one by one. I know all about your secret Tuesday lunch dates at that expensive French bistro on 4th Avenue, where you blatantly held hands across the table. I know all about the 3 separate times you parked your car in this very driveway when you knew Arya was out of town on business. I possess the complete digital logs, Brianna. I have the exact timestamps. I have the documented mileage. He stared at her with a profound, crushing sense of absolute pity. I definitely did not come here today to bravely fight for you. I came here solely to legally serve you. You are completely free now. You can happily have him. Brianna frantically looked at Gavin, and then quickly back at Declan, the horrifying realization finally dawning that her luxurious financial safety net was permanently gone. She hadn't merely lost a devoted husband. She had entirely lost her funded lifestyle, her financial stability, and her carefully crafted social reputation. Declan fully turned his back on her. He looked directly at me, and for the very first time since he had arrived, his dark eyes slightly softened. I'm incredibly sorry you had to witness this, Arya, he said quietly. I'm truly not, I instantly replied. I vastly prefer the absolute truth, no matter how incredibly ugly it is. Gavin, sensing the power dynamic entirely shifting away from him, desperately tried to speak up once more. You can't just illegally track people without their written consent. That is literal stalking. Declan casually glanced over his shoulder. Actually, Gavin, the vehicle is fully registered in my name alone. I can legally track my own private property wherever I please, just exactly like Arya here can legally evict whoever she pleases. He calmly walked completely out of the master bathroom, leaving the damp divorce papers slowly soaking up the spilled water on the floor. It was a profoundly fitting end to a toxic marriage entirely constructed on cheap lies. The massive silence he left behind in his wake was far heavier than any loud scream could have ever been. Gavin's face had turned a deep shade of crimson that clashed violently with the bright white towel wrapped tightly around his waist. He stared at Declan's retreating back, and then violently spun around to face me, his eyes bulging terrifyingly with a toxic mixture of wild rage and sheer panic. He deeply realized he was rapidly losing all control of the overarching narrative, and his base instinct was simply to get louder, to forcefully assert dominance through sheer auditory volume. This is completely insane, he screamed, his voice painfully cracking. You cannot just illegally kick me out onto the street. This is my home. My actual name is on the mailbox outside. My name is on the damn electric bill. I have legally lived here for 5 years, Arya. That firmly establishes legal residency. That legally establishes ownership. You cannot just bypass the courts and evict a legal husband from his own home like he is some kind of homeless squatter. He aggressively marched over to the makeup vanity counter where a small stack of recent mail was sitting. He forcefully grabbed a white utility envelope and aggressively shoved it directly toward the police officer's stoic face. Look closely at this. Gavin Hayes. That is me. This undeniably proves this is my primary, legal residence. Tell this crazy woman she cannot force me to leave. Tell her that if she truly wants me out, she has to legally go through a formal court eviction process that takes minimum 6 months. The police officer calmly looked at the violently crumpled envelope and then slowly shifted his gaze to Ms. Palmer. He looked incredibly bored. He had clearly dealt with this exact flavor of male desperation countless times before. He casually gestured to the sharp-dressed lawyer. Ma'am, do you currently possess the specific legal documentation you mentioned earlier? Ms. Palmer confidently stepped forward. Her calculated movements were incredibly calm and laser-precise, directly contrasting with Gavin's frantic, sweaty energy. She smoothly opened her expensive leather portfolio and carefully pulled out a thick document bound with a prem. Blue cover and a heavy gold notary seal. She deliberately did not hand it to Gavin. She handed it directly to the police officer. "Officer," she stated, her voice as smooth as rich silk, "what Mr. Hayes is currently holding is merely a basic monthly bill for electricity usage. What I am currently handing you is the ironclad warranty deed and the formal declaration of trust for this entire estate." Gavin instantly froze. "Trust," he stammered weakly. "What trust?" Ms. Palmer slowly turned to him and sharply adjusted her designer glasses. "The *A&D Family Trust *, Gavin. It was legally established by Arya's late grandmother over 20 years ago. The massive property we are currently standing inside was outright purchased entirely by that specific trust long before you ever even met Arya. The legal trust is the sole, absolute legal owner of this entire estate. Arya is the sole, exclusive beneficiary. You are absolutely not listed anywhere on the deed. You are not listed as a legal trustee. You are not even officially listed as a registered tenant." She intentionally paused to let the devastating words fully sink into his thick skull. "Legally speaking, Mr. Hayes, you are merely a house guest, a temporary guest who has been generously allowed to stay here strictly at the pleasure of the trust's beneficiary. And as of exactly 10 minutes ago, that pleasure has been permanently revoked." I quietly watched the horrifying realization violently hit him. It was exactly like watching a massive skyscraper collapse in slow motion. He stared at me, his mouth gaping wide open in utter disbelief. You never once told me this house was sitting in a trust." I casually took a long sip of my expensive wine, which I had purposefully carried all the way up from the kitchen. "I absolutely didn't have to tell you, Gavin," I replied with chilling calmness. "You simply never bothered to ask. You were so incredibly happy living in absolute luxury, driving expensive sports cars you didn't pay for, and sleeping soundly in a multi-million-dollar house you never bought, that you never once bothered to ask whose actual name was printed on the legal paper. You just arrogantly assumed that simply because you managed to marry me, you automatically owned me and every single thing I possessed." Ms. Palmer smoothly continued twisting the legal knife with surgical precision. "Since there is absolutely no signed lease agreement on file, and you have personally made exactly 0 mortgage payments, you possess absolutely 0 claim to any tenancy rights. The legal homeowner has officially revoked your permission to remain on the premises. Therefore, your continued stubborn presence here constitutes an active criminal trespass." The tall officer looked up from reviewing the dense document. "The legal paperwork looks completely solid, ma'am." He sternly turned to Gavin and pointed directly toward the bedroom door. "Sir, you have exactly 5 minutes to get fully dressed and voluntarily vacate the premises. If you are still standing here in 6 minutes, you will be physically placed under arrest for trespassing. And sir, if you intentionally damage a single item on your way out, we will happily add malicious vandalism to your criminal charges." Gavin frantically looked around the luxurious room, desperately searching for an ally, searching for a legal loophole, but there was absolutely none to be found. The expensive walls he falsely thought he owned were rapidly closing in on him. The beautiful bathroom he had disgustingly defiled with my younger sister was now operating as his temporary prison cell, and the absolute only way out was an incredibly humiliating walk of shame directly past all of our wealthy neighbors. The officer's deep voice acted as the final, damning gavel, completely striking down Gavin's wild delusion. He stepped intimidatingly forward, his hand resting casually but incredibly firmly on his heavy utility belt. "Mr. Hayes, you heard the lady. You are actively trespassing on private property legally owned by the A&D Trust. You have exactly 3 minutes left to vacate these premises before I place you in handcuffs." Gavin frantically looked around the massive bathroom. His panicked eyes darted rapidly from the armed officer to me, and finally toward the expansive walk-in closet where his expensive, bespoke Italian suits were neatly hanging. "Fine," he spat venomously, desperately trying to salvage a microscopic shred of his shattered dignity. "I will gladly leave, but I am absolutely taking all of my personal things. I am not leaving this house without my custom clothes, my expensive watches, and my work laptop." He violently pushed past the tall officer and made a desperate, frantic dash toward the closet doors. Brianna immediately followed him, hastily snatching up her $12,000 designer handbag from the marble vanity. Not so fast, Ms. Palmer commanded, her sharp voice freezing them in their tracks. She quickly signaled to the second police officer, who instantly stepped directly in front of the closet doors, physically blocking Gavin's path. Gavin stopped incredibly short, his chest heaving with exertion. "What now?" he screamed furiously. "Those are my personal things. I personally bought them." "Actually," Ms. Palmer countered, smoothly consulting her clipboard, "you purchased every single item using a joint luxury credit card that is directly linked to Arya's primary bank account." In the state of Washington, any physical assets acquired during the duration of a marriage are strictly considered community property until formally divided by a family court judge. However, since we currently possess irrefutable, undeniable evidence of massive, significant dissipation of marital assets for explicit, illicit purposes, we have officially filed an emergency legal motion to freeze all movable assets. She looked sternly over her glasses directly at him. That legally means absolutely nothing leaves this house today. No custom suits, no expensive electronics, no luxury jewelry, and most certainly not that gold Rolex sitting on the nightstand, which was a direct gift from Arya and is therefore entirely subject to legal revocation under the infidelity clause. Gavin looked like he was about to suffer a massive stroke. "You absolutely cannot be serious. You expect me to just walk out of here wearing nothing but a damn towel." I confidently stepped forward. "No, Gavin, I am absolutely not heartless. You can legally take the exact clothes you were wearing when you arrived today." I pointed down to the chaotic pile of crumpled clothes resting on the wet floor. "And you can take your basic toiletries. Absolutely anything else with a retail value of over $500 securely stays right here until a formal judge decides otherwise." Brianna shrieked, clutching her expensive Hermes bag tightly to her chest. "This custom bag cost $12,000. You cannot possibly keep it. It is legally mine." The officer smoothly reached out and gently, but incredibly firmly, pried the expensive bag from her tight grip. "Then it securely stays right here, ma'am. If you attempt to forcefully remove it, we will instantly charge you with felony theft of marital assets." The crushing realization of exactly what was happening finally broke them completely. They were being systematically, legally stripped of their shiny armor. Without the expensive, custom suits, without the luxury accessories, without the high-end status symbols, they were merely two pathetic cheaters caught red-handed in a disgusting lie. Gavin dressed incredibly hurriedly in his deeply wrinkled trousers and damp dress shirt, his hands physically shaking so violently he could barely manage to button his cuffs. He desperately tried to stealthily slide his expensive laptop into his suit jacket, but the eagle-eyed officer immediately saw him. "Leave it right there," the officer barked aggressively. Gavin violently slammed the laptop down onto the granite counter. "This is literal theft, Arya. I have incredibly important corporate work files stored on there." I smiled sweetly. "I know. And since you completed that specific work while currently employed by my company, on a laptop fully purchased by my company, all of that proprietary data legally belongs to me, too." Backed into an inescapable corner with absolutely no legal leg to stand on, Gavin and Brianna were forcefully forced to retreat. They suddenly looked incredibly small. They looked cheap. For years, they had arrogantly defined themselves solely by the expensive things I bought for them. Now, brutally stripped of those shiny things, they were nothing. "Let's move," the officer commanded, physically steering them toward the bedroom door. I peacefully watched them walk out of the master suite. Brianna was completely barefoot, awkwardly carrying her designer heels because she genuinely couldn't walk properly in them without her usual false confidence. Gavin looked exactly like a completely deflated balloon. They were leaving behind the luxurious life they falsely thought they deserved, and walking directly toward the harsh, unforgiving reality they had actually earned. The humiliating descent down the floating glass staircase was a truly pathetic, reversed version of the grand, arrogant entrance they usually made. Typically, Gavin strolled down these specific stairs adjusting his expensive cufflinks like he owned the entire world, while Brianna would gracefully glide down in her designer heels, eagerly waiting for compliments. Today, however, they were being marched down like common, petty criminals, heavily flanked by fully uniformed police officers. Their heads hung incredibly low to actively avoid making eye contact with my private cleaning staff, who had eagerly gathered in the main hallway to watch the show. The heavy mahogany front door swung wide open, and the incredibly bright afternoon sun of Seattle hit them like a blinding stay. Spotlight. In an ultra-exclusive neighborhood like the Highlands, privacy is merely a costly illusion that we pay millions for but never actually receive. The actively flashing blue lights of the 2 patrol cruisers parked in my expansive circular driveway had already successfully done their job. The neighborhood audience had fully assembled. Mrs. Hopkins from next door was poorly pretending to trim her pristine hedges, but her clippers weren't moving an inch. The breathless, sweaty jogger from down the block had conveniently stopped to tie his running shoe for the 3rd consecutive time. Even the local Amazon delivery driver had completely paused his route scanner to openly watch the unfolding spectacle. They all saw everything. Gavin Hayes, the arrogant man who constantly bragged loudly about his low golf handicap and his booming stock portfolio, was being forcefully escorted out of his massive mansion by the police, wearing terribly wrinkled clothes and looking like he hadn't slept in a full week. Beside him, Brianna desperately clutched her chest, attempting to hide her flushed face behind her damp hair, walking entirely barefoot on the rough asphalt because she had been strictly forbidden from wearing the shoes that were technically classified as marital assets. I walked completely calmly through the master bedroom and out onto the private, sprawling balcony that directly overlooked the long driveway. The cool, refreshing breeze felt incredibly cleansing against my heated skin. I leaned casually against the wrought iron railing, the cold metal physically grounding me from up here. They honestly looked exactly like tiny ants, small, utterly insignificant ants who had stupidly bitten the wrong person. Gavin slowly looked up and saw me standing there. For a fleeting moment, I saw a brilliant flash of pure hatred in his eyes, but it was quickly, permanently extinguished by the crushing realization of his bleak reality. He furiously shouted something up at me, but the wind easily carried the pathetic words away. He looked desperately at his car, a sleek, black Porsche parked neatly near the stone fountain, and reached frantically into his empty pocket. His face dramatically fell. The expensive keys were sitting in the decorative bowl on the foyer table inside the house. He was entirely stranded. Brianna was openly sobbing now. She rapidly realized there was absolutely no luxury Uber coming to save her. She frantically turned to Declan, who had quietly walked out right behind the police officers. She reached desperately for his arm, but he smoothly sidestepped her with a grace that was almost balletic. He simply walked straight past her, got into his own heavy truck, and calmly started the engine. He didn't look back once. I raised my crystal wine glass in a completely silent toast. It was certainly not a toast to their future health or happiness. It was a firm toast to the profound, beautiful silence they were finally leaving behind. The police officer sternly pointed down the incredibly long driveway, actively indicating that they needed to keep moving until they were completely off the property line. As they began the long, deeply humiliating walk down the steep hill toward the main security gate, lazily dragging their bare feet on the hard pavement, I took the absolute final sip of my premium wine. It tasted exactly like pure justice. Rich, highly complex, and leaving an incredibly warm feeling deep in my chest. The trash had finally taken itself out. I walked back inside from the windy balcony, and the entire house genuinely felt different. It was significantly lighter, as if the very air inside had been completely purified by their sudden departure. But I intimately knew the silence was only a temporary reprieve. The deeply ingrained mechanism of my family's intense dysfunction was highly predictable, like a precision clockwork machine. Whenever the beloved golden child falls, the chief enabler is instantly summoned to cushion the landing. I poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water this time, desperately needing a highly clear head for the inevitable round 2. My smartphone began to vibrate aggressively on the marble kitchen countertop. I didn't even need to look at the bright screen to know exactly who it was, but I looked anyway. The screen glaringly lit up with the singular word, Mother Asterisk. Not Mom, not Mommy, just Mother Asterisk. A strict, formal title she constantly demanded but rarely actually earned. I let it ring 3 full times. I took a slow sip of water. I calmly adjusted my silk cuff. Then I smoothly slid my thumb across the screen and put the call on speakerphone. Aria Elizabeth. The shrill voice on the other end shrieked violently before I could even manage to say hello. Have you completely lost your damn mind? I just got off the phone with your sister. She is entirely hysterical. She is literally standing on the side of a busy road completely barefoot. How could you possibly be so incredibly cruel? I leaned casually against the granite counter, passively listening to the all-too-familiar rhythmic cadence of her misplaced rage. It was perpetually like this. In Priscilla's twisted world, Brianna's terrible actions were never, ever the actual problem, only my completely justified reactions to them were. She slept with my husband, Mother, I stated, deliberately keeping my voice as flat as glass. In my house, in my bathtub. Oh, please stop being so ridiculously dramatic. Priscilla snapped dismissively. It was merely a mistake. People make mistakes, Arya. But you do absolutely not throw your own flesh and blood family out onto the street like discarded garbage. You do not publicly humiliate your sister and your own husband in front of the entire neighborhood. Do you have any earthly idea what Mrs. Hopkins is going to say at the country club tomorrow? You have completely ruined our social reputation. And there it was. The absolute, undeniable core of the issue. It was never about my intense heartbreak or the vile betrayal of her son-in-law. It was entirely about her fragile reputation at the local country club. It was exclusively about how this scandal reflected upon her asterisk. They completely ruined their own reputation, I replied coldly. I just merely expedited the inevitable process, and they are not currently on the street. They are actively walking toward the main security gate. I'm quite sure Gavin can call one of his sleazy drinking buddies to pick them up, since you clearly raised a daughter who seemingly doesn't even know how to hail an Uber. Arya, you listen to me right this second, Priscilla shouted, her voice violently trembling with sheer indignation. You will immediately let them back inside. You will offer a sincere apology, and you will all sit down and discuss this issue like mature adults. Marriage is entirely about compromise. You cannot just casually throw Gavin away simply because he slightly stumbled. He didn't stumble, Mother, I said, sharply cutting her off. He fell completely naked into a jacuzzi with his own sister-in-law, and I am absolutely not compromising on my personal dignity. You are a freezing, highly vindictive girl, Priscilla spat. You always have been. You genuinely think just because you possess money, you can cruelly control everyone. Well, you're going to immediately fix this. Do you hear me? Fix this right now or I swear. I didn't bother waiting for the incoming threat. I intimately knew exactly what was coming. Empty threats of formally disowning me. Fake threats of permanently cutting me off from all family holidays. Meaningless threats from a bitter woman who officially possessed zero leverage left over me. I am completely done fixing things, Mother, I stated firmly. Go pick them up yourself if you are so incredibly worried. I tapped the bright red icon, instantly ending the call. The silence returned instantaneously, but I knew with certainty she would immediately call right back. She would call and call relentlessly until I finally submitted, because that is exactly how she operated. She slowly wore people down. I stared at her name glaring on my screen. I tapped the small information icon located right next to it. I scrolled all the way down to the very bottom of the menu list. My index finger hovered briefly over the option written in stark red text. Block this caller. I firmly pressed it. A pop-up swiftly asked me to confirm the action. I tapped asterisk yes asterisk. For the very first time in my 34 years of existence, I had permanently silenced the toxic voice that constantly told me I was entirely wrong for simply demanding basic respect. It felt absolutely terrifying. But more than that, it felt utterly exhilarating. I set the phone face down on the counter. The Queen had officially been blocked, but I knew the King and Queen were already aggressively on their way to physically storm the castle in person. I had approximately 20 minutes to fully prepare to raise the drawbridge. 30 minutes. That was exactly how long it realistically took for the entire cavalry of family dysfunction to physically arrive. I was sitting quietly in the formal living room, allowing the deep silence to settle comfortably around me, when the heavy front door violently shook. It was certainly not a polite knock. It was a heavy, incredibly demanding pounding that actively threatened to crack the frosted glass panels. I absolutely didn't need to check the home security camera feed to know exactly who it was. I deeply knew that aggressive rhythm. It was the undeniable sound of my mother, Priscilla, violently demanding an immediate audience. I walked slowly to the door, my movements highly controlled and entirely deliberate. I was not afraid in the slightest. I was just profoundly exhausted by the absolute predictability of it all. I unbolted the door, and before I could even take a step back, they aggressively pushed their way. Inside the foyer, my father entered first, looking extremely red-faced and highly uncomfortable, followed immediately by my mother, who looked exactly like she was fully prepared to burn the entire estate down to the ground. She did not even glance at my face to check if I had been crying. She didn't bother to ask how I was emotionally holding up after discovering my husband in bed with her other daughter. She didn't offer a motherly hug or a single, solitary word of comfort. Instead, she aggressively threw her expensive designer purse onto the entryway table, my entryway table, and immediately turned on me with eyes entirely full of burning accusation. "I deeply hope you are incredibly proud of yourself," she hissed, her voice violently vibrating with entirely misplaced anger. "I literally just passed your sister out on the main highway. She is walking, Arya, walking exactly like a filthy vagrant on the side of the road." Regular people were openly staring at her. "Do you have any earthly idea how deeply humiliating that is for us? Do you know who I am in this town?" I merely stared at her, genuinely marveling at her entirely warped priorities. "She slept with my husband, mother," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. "In my own bathtub, inside the home that I entirely pay for." Priscilla waved her manicured hand highly dismissively, precisely as if I had merely complained about Gavin leaving the toilet seat up. "Oh, please stop being so incredibly dramatic," she scoffed loudly. "Men inevitably make mistakes, Arya. It is literally in their biological nature to stray sometimes. Gavin is a very young, highly successful man with certain needs. If you were actually home more often instead of constantly chasing your little corporate career, maybe he wouldn't have actively looked elsewhere. You directly drove him to it with your constant coldness. You absolutely cannot expect a virile man to just wait around while you continuously play boss." The vicious words physically hit me like a heavy slap, but I refused to flinch. She was actually entirely blaming me. She was physically standing right in my own foyer, aggressively rewriting objective reality just to ensure the victim became the villain, all to protect Brianna. She relentlessly continued, her voice rapidly rising to a piercing shriek. "She is your little sister, your own flesh and blood. You are deeply supposed to fiercely protect her, not entirely destroy her life over one tiny moment of weakness. She is young. She genuinely didn't know what she was doing. You are the older one. You are supposed to be the highly mature one. You should have easily been the bigger person and handled this entirely quietly." My father nodded weakly in agreement, finally chiming in from the corner. "Your mother is absolutely right, Arya. You went incredibly too far by calling the police. We settle these kinds of things internally, inside the family. We absolutely do not air our dirty laundry for all the neighbors to openly see. You have completely embarrassed us all today." I stared at them standing in the grand foyer of the massive house I bought, actively defending the very people who had violently betrayed me. The crushing realization washed completely over me, cold, absolute, and final. They genuinely did not love me. They merely tolerated me for as long as I remained useful, for exactly as long as I silently kept the peace. But the exact moment I inconvenienced their beloved golden child, I instantly became the ultimate enemy. "I am absolutely not the bigger person anymore," I stated coldly, taking a physical step backward to establish distance between us. "I am the person who physically signs the checks, and right now, I am the person who is entirely done listening to you attempt to justify their gross cruelty." I looked at my parents standing there, the very air thick with their entirely misplaced judgment, and I decisively decided to immediately detonate the absolute nuclear option. If my spoken words wouldn't convince them, maybe high-definition audio evidence finally would. I pulled my smartphone from my blazer pocket and tapped the glowing screen, instantly connecting to the massive living room display system. I deliberately didn't play the explicit video of them naked, as that would be entirely undignified. Instead, I played the crisp audio recording of their incredibly candid conversation from the exact moment I had locked the bathroom door. Gavin's arrogant voice instantly filled the high, vaulted ceilings of the entryway, artificially amplified and terrifyingly clear. "She is an absolute ice queen," he sneered on the crystal-clear recording. "You are the absolute only one who truly understands me, baby." Then came Brianna's distinct giggle, highly recognizable and incredibly cruel. "She seriously doesn't even deserve you, Gavin. She treats you exactly like a lowly employee." I watched my mother's face intensely, eagerly waiting for the crushing shame to hit. I was waiting for the dawning horror of realizing her youngest daughter was happily sleeping with her eldest daughter's husband. I genuinely expected her to cover her mouth in shock, to gasp loudly, to finally look at me with a deep apology in her eyes. But the shame absolutely never came. Priscilla actually rolled her eyes. She physically rolled her eyes at the undeniable sound of her son-in-law brutally betraying her daughter. "Turn that garbage off," she snapped aggressively, waving her manicured hand as if casually shooing away a buzzing fly. "It is entirely vulgar, Arya. Secretly recording people in private is a massive violation of basic trust. I genuinely cannot believe you would stoop so incredibly low." I paused the recording, my hand shaking slightly, not from any fear, but from pure, unadulterated disbelief. "Mom, did you actually just hear what they said? He is openly admitting to sleeping with her. She is actively mocking me. This is undeniably not a misunderstanding. This is a full-blown affair." Priscilla sighed the highly dramatic, long-suffering sigh of a professional martyr. "I merely heard a man who is incredibly lonely, Arya. I heard a man who is actively crying out for basic affection because his wife is far too busy climbing the corporate ladder to bother keeping his bed warm. And I heard a deeply caring sister who simply stepped in to comfort him when you were entirely absent. If you had actually prioritized your own marriage instead of your massive ego, maybe Gavin wouldn't have desperately needed to look elsewhere. You drove him entirely to this." The entire world completely stopped spinning. For a second, there it was, the absolute undeniable proof that I could simply never, ever win. In the twisted, completely rigged court of my family, I was found guilty by default. If Gavin cheated, it was solely because I worked too hard. If Brianna betrayed me, it was solely because I wasn't supportive enough. I was the permanent scapegoat. I had always been the designated scapegoat. I was the one who perpetually fixed the massive problems and quietly took the heavy blame, while Brianna was the golden child who created the endless chaos and received all the sympathy. I looked desperately at my father, hoping for a tiny sliver of rationality. "Dad," I pleaded, my voice incredibly quiet, "you cannot possibly agree with this. You cannot honestly think this is entirely my fault." He awkwardly shifted his weight, looking down at the expensive Persian rug rather than meeting my eyes. He was a deeply weak man, I suddenly realized. A hollow man who had spent 40 entire years constantly bowing to my mother's wild delusions simply to keep the peace in his own house. "Your mother honestly has a strong point, Arya," he mumbled pathetically. "You have been incredibly distant lately. You truly cannot blame Gavin for desperately seeking human connection. And Brianna is highly sensitive. You know she needs gentle guidance, not harsh judgment." I felt a very strange, distinct sensation deep in my chest. It was the physical snapping of the absolute final tether. The invisible, toxic cord that had bound me entirely to their approval for 34 years finally broke. I realized in that exact moment that absolutely no amount of corporate success, no amount of money, and no amount of objective truth would ever make them love me the way they blindly loved her. They didn't genuinely want a daughter. They solely wanted an ATM and a doormat, and I was completely done lying down. I looked directly at the woman who gave birth to me and felt absolutely, undeniably nothing. The burning anger had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold clarity that was incredibly sharp and hard like a flawless diamond. For years, I had dutifully played by their rigged rules. I had bought the expensive gifts, hosted all the lavish holidays, and silently swallowed the endless insults, desperately hoping that one day they would look at me with the exact same blind adoration they constantly gave to Brianna. But standing right there in my foyer, with the undeniable evidence of my husband's gross infidelity being casually dismissed as a minor mistake, I realized the entire game was rigged from the start. I could never win because, to them, I wasn't even a player. I was just the bank. I took a deep, centering breath and squared my shoulders. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I stated, my voice incredibly steady and loud enough to actively echo off the high vaulted ceiling. "Brianna is indeed your precious daughter. Gavin is your beloved son-in-law. They are family. And since you are so incredibly concerned about their overall well-being, I have the perfect solution." Priscilla looked at me, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What exactly are you talking about?" I walked smoothly to the front door and pulled it incredibly wide open, letting the cool evening air forcefully rush into the heated tension of the hallway. I am saying that they are entirely your problem now. If you honestly think what they did is acceptable, then you can easily house them. You can feed them. You can actively pay for all their expensive clothes and their lavish lifestyle, because as of this exact moment, the Bank of Aria is permanently closed for business. My father rapidly stepped forward, looking highly alarmed. Now, Aria, please be reasonable. You absolutely cannot just cut everyone off. We are your parents. I looked him completely dead in the eye. I am being entirely reasonable, Dad. I am permanently removing the highly toxic elements from my entire life. And right now, that definitively includes you. You literally stood there and quietly watched Mom entirely blame me for Gavin cheating. You stood there and let her call me cruel for simply protecting myself. You actively made your choice. You firmly chose them, so go be with them. Priscilla gasped loudly, dramatically clutching her pearls in a gesture so incredibly cliché it would have been hilarious if it weren't so pathetic. You are literally kicking us out of your own house. You will deeply regret this, Aria. You will be completely all alone in this massive, empty mansion, and you will inevitably come crawling back to us, begging for our forgiveness. I laughed. It was a completely genuine laugh, incredibly free and entirely unburdened. Mother, just look around you. I built this entirely myself. I exclusively own this. I absolutely do not need you to survive. But let us just see exactly how long Brianna lasts when she has to formally ask you for money instead of secretly stealing it from me. Let us see just how much you truly love Gavin when he is totally unemployed and sleeping on your living room couch. I pointed firmly to the open door. Get out, both of you, and absolutely do not come back until you are fully ready to offer me a genuine apology. And I mean a real apology, not one of your classic gaslighting lectures. Priscilla turned a deep shade of purple I had never previously seen before. She violently grabbed her expensive purse and aggressively marched out the door, her heels clicking angrily on the stone porch. You are an incredibly cold, utterly heartless girl, she spat viciously as she passed me. I have absolutely no daughter. Good, I instantly replied. Then you definitely won't mind losing my phone number. My father looked at me one absolute last time, a tiny, pathetic flicker of genuine regret visible in his eyes, but he was far too incredibly weak to act on it. He simply followed her out like he always did, a pathetic shadow to her raging fire. I forcefully slammed the heavy front door shut. The loud sound was exactly like a gunshot, absolutely final and totally decisive. I firmly engaged the heavy deadbolt. Click, click. I slowly turned around and leaned my back entirely against the heavy wood, slowly sliding down until I was sitting firmly on the floor. The massive house was entirely silent. Completely, utterly silent. There was absolutely no cheating husband actively lying to me upstairs. There was absolutely no toxic sister secretly stealing from me. There were absolutely no enabling parents harshly judging me. I was entirely alone. And for the absolute first time in my entire life, being alone definitely did not feel like loneliness. It felt exactly like pure, unadulterated freedom. The brutal war for my family was officially over. Now, the high-stakes war for my corporate empire was about to begin. The sun had barely risen over the breathtaking Seattle skyline when Gavin aggressively marched into the grand lobby of Lumina Lifestyle headquarters. He was running entirely on pure adrenaline and the wild, delusional belief that if he just moved fast enough, he could easily outrun the truth. He was wearing one of the incredibly few suits I had graciously allowed him to keep, a navy blue number that was notably slightly too tight around his shoulders. It was a subtle, physical reminder that he was absolutely no longer living in the custom-tailored, luxurious world he had grown so accustomed to. He didn't go to his plush corner office first. He went completely straight to the secure server room located on the 4th floor. He aggressively cornered Kyle, our talented director of IT, before the poor man had even managed to finish his first cup of morning coffee. Gavin violently slammed his heavy hand onto Kyle's desk, causing a massive stack of coding manuals to topple over onto the floor. I want Aria's entire system access permanently revoked, he demanded, his voice aggressively echoing in the usually quiet open-plan office. Cut her company email, entirely disable her building keycard, actively lock her out of the shared network drive. Do it right now. Kyle blinked rapidly, looking highly confused and genuinely terrified. Sir, Mrs. Hayes is the literal founder of the company. I absolutely cannot just lock her out of her own corporate system. I am the acting CEO, Kyle, Gavin shouted, his eyes wide and wild. And I am explicitly telling you she is currently a massive security risk. She is having a severe mental breakdown. She is highly vindictive and entirely unstable. If she successfully logs in, she will maliciously sabotage all of our client data. Do you honestly want to be held personally responsible for entirely losing the main client database, Kyle? Do you want to be fired today for gross insubordination? Kyle looked fearfully at Gavin's violently shaking hands and the heavy sweat profusely beading on his forehead. He foolishly did exactly what most entry-level employees do when aggressively faced with a screaming, unhinged executive. He complied. He nervously typed the command and hit enter. In Gavin's incredibly flawed mind, that single keystroke was a massive victory. He genuinely thought he had just entirely cut off my corporate oxygen. In absolute reality, he had just completely cut the brake lines on a speeding car he was actively driving straight toward a steep cliff. Gavin marched victoriously to his plush corner office, slamming the heavy glass door securely shut. He sat arrogantly at his massive mahogany desk, the desk I entirely paid for, and aggressively opened his laptop. He began typing furiously. He desperately needed to entirely control the corporate narrative before I physically arrived. He needed the entire company to view me solely as a dangerous liability, not a respected leader. At exactly 7:15 a.m., a high-priority notification loudly pinged on the cell phones of all 200 Lumina Lifestyle employees. The bold subject line read, "Urgent lead. Our ship update." I calmly read it from my personal tablet while sitting comfortably at my kitchen island, slowly sipping a double espresso. The email was a genuine, undisputed masterpiece of corporate gaslighting. "Dear team," it began, "it is with an incredibly heavy heart that I must formally announce Arya is taking an indefinite, mandatory leave of absence, effective immediately. Due to recent, highly severe personal struggles, she is actively seeking necessary psychological treatment to properly address severe emotional instability. During this incredibly difficult transition time, I will be formally assuming full, absolute control of all creative and operational decisions to ensure the continued stability of our great company. Please respect her absolute privacy and carefully direct all urgent corporate matters solely to me." I put the tablet down and genuinely laughed out loud. He had actually done it. He had stupidly put it completely in writing. He had actively used his official company email account to publicly libel the majority shareholder, falsely claiming I was entirely mentally unstable without possessing a single shred of actual medical evidence. He actually thought this email was his impenetrable shield. He completely didn't realize he had just willingly handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to officially activate the immediate termination clause heavily embedded in his contract. Gavin leaned back comfortably in his expensive leather chair in that glass office, feeling exactly like a conquering king. He actively watched the various employees trickling in, seeing them whisper in hushed tones and frantically look at their phones. He arrogantly thought they were whispering about my alleged breakdown. He didn't realize they were actively whispering about him, because what Gavin entirely forgot was that genuine loyalty in the business world is never bought with shiny titles. It is strictly earned with deep respect. And while he was busy playing pretend CEO, I was already actively on the phone with the primary board members he had just attempted to entirely deceive. The massive corporate war had officially started, and he had just stupidly fired the first shot directly at a heavily armored tank. By 9:00 a.m., the office was absolutely no longer a place of professional business. It was a massive, churning rumor mill actively producing fiction at a record-breaking pace. Gavin's email had initially lit the match, but Brianna was the one gleefully pouring endless gasoline onto the flames. She arrived at the office wearing unnecessarily large designer sunglasses and a deeply somber expression, successfully playing the dramatic role of the highly concerned sister to absolute perfection. Despite being entirely stripped of her luxury assets the previous night, she confidently walked into the marketing department with her head held high, completely ready to heavily spin the narrative of her life. She intentionally didn't hide in her office. She went on a highly calculated, dramatic tour. She strategically stopped by the main break room where the aggressive sales team gathered. She intentionally lingered at the front receptionist desk, where the administrative assistants heavily gossiped. Her voice was highly hushed and deeply conspiratorial, perfectly designed to draw people in exactly like mindless moths to a flame. "It is just so incredibly tragic," she whispered softly to a group of naive junior copywriters, dramatically wiping away another non-existent tear. "Arya has just been under so much immense pressure lately. We honestly tried to ignore the early warning signs, but last night she finally, completely snapped. She violently attacked Gavin and me. She forcefully locked us inside a bathroom and started screaming wildly about affairs that were absolutely not happening. She was completely hallucinating. We are just desperately trying to get her the medical help she urgently needs before she physically hurts herself or destroys the company." The gullible staff absolutely ate it up. It was precisely the kind of juicy office drama that made the long workday go significantly faster. They nodded sympathetically, looking at the completely empty CEO office with deep pity, entirely not realizing they were mourning a competent leader who was perfectly sane and actively plotting their imminent liberation from her marble kitchen table. Brianna successfully framed herself as the tragic victim, and Gavin as the bold hero bravely stepping up to save the rapidly sinking ship. It was a truly brilliant marketing campaign for a completely fraudulent product. But while Brianna was incredibly busy successfully winning the war of words upstairs, down in the architectural studio, Declan was quietly, successfully winning the war of actual assets. The atmosphere inside his specific department was entirely different. It possessed the quiet, terrifying intensity of a highly trained bomb squad. Declan did not gossip. He absolutely did not read Gavin's email twice. He simply walked directly to the secure, fireproof archives where the physical original blueprints were stored. He methodically began pulling all the master files. These were definitely not just basic sketches. These were the highly proprietary, extremely complex blueprints for our 3 absolute biggest upcoming Terra Green estates. The technical specifications, the structural load calculations, and the hard-won zoning approvals. This was the massive intellectual property that entirely justified our high stock valuation. He carefully rolled them up one by one, securely placing them into waterproof black travel tubes. A young, junior architect nervously watched him with incredibly wide eyes. "Declan, what exactly are you doing?" the young man asked, his voice shaking. "Gavin explicitly said we are on absolute lockdown." Declan absolutely did not stop packing. He didn't even look up. He smoothly slid a massive, encrypted hard drive into his heavy leather briefcase. "Gavin says a lot of things," Declan replied, his voice incredibly low and entirely steady. "But Gavin absolutely cannot draw a straight line using a ruler. I highly suggest you update your resume today, kid. Massive changes are coming." He forcefully closed his heavy briefcase with a loud asterisk snap asterisk. It was the absolute only sound in the tense room. While the rest of the entire company was completely distracted by Brianna's cheap soap opera, Declan had quietly, successfully secured the literal heart of the entire business. Gavin could comfortably sit in the CEO chair all day long. But without the intricate designs Declan actively held in his hands, Gavin was merely the captain of a massive ship, entirely missing its engine. The deep silence in Declan's office was absolutely deafening compared to the chaotic noise in the hallway. It was the calculated silence of a man who intimately knew exactly where the structural weaknesses were and was actively preparing to pull the pin. The emergency shareholder meeting officially began at exactly 10:00 a.m. sharp inside the massive, glass-walled conference room that proudly offered a panoramic, stunning view of the sprawling city I had successfully conquered. Gavin proudly stood at the head of the incredibly long mahogany table, a specific spot that I usually occupied. He was confidently wearing that exact same ill-fitting navy suit, but he wore it entirely with the unearned confidence of a man who fully believed his own fake press release. Seated around the massive table sat the 12 powerful board members, including several old, wealthy friends of my father, who all looked highly uncomfortable and kept nervously checking their expensive watches. Gavin loudly cleared his throat and confidently launched into the acting performance of a lifetime. He impressively didn't use any written notes. He entirely relied on his natural charisma, the exact same toxic charm that had successfully fooled me for 5 long years. He passionately spoke about corporate duty. He spoke deeply about personal sacrifice. He expertly painted a vivid picture of a massive company in deep crisis, not because of poor financial mismanagement or unexpected market shifts, but entirely because of my alleged severe emotional collapse. "We all truly love Arya," Gavin stated, his voice dripping heavily with a sickening, faux sympathy. "She is the brilliant visionary who originally started Lumina Lifestyle, but we absolutely cannot let our deep sentimentality sink this massive ship. The brilliant Arya we all knew is entirely gone. The deeply disturbed woman who violently attacked me and her own sister yesterday is simply not the stable leader this company desperately needs right now. Her recent behavior was highly erratic, completely violent, and deeply disturbing. She is currently a massive danger to herself, and far more importantly, she is an active danger to the very integrity of our corporate brand." He intentionally paused for dramatic effect, looking slowly around the room to make meaningful eye contact with each individual member. He was expertly playing directly on their worst fears. He intimately knew that wealthy investors completely hate market volatility, and he was actively framing me as the ultimate, unpredictable variable. He absolutely did not mention his gross affair. He completely avoided mentioning the impending divorce. He expertly framed his hostile coup as a necessary, brave rescue mission. "We desperately need absolute stability," Gavin continued, softly slamming his hands down on the mahogany table for added emphasis. "We urgently need a steady, reliable hand at the wheel. I have bravely stepped up to directly take on the massive burden of corporate leadership during this highly tragic time. I am formally asking for your full vote of confidence today, not for me personally, but for the hundreds of dedicated employees who entirely rely on us for their daily livelihood. We must urgently move forward with a formal motion to completely remove Arya from her operational duties, permanently." The room was utterly silent. I could easily imagine the older board members nodding slowly in agreement. They were conservative men from my father's older generation, men who genuinely found it vastly easier to blindly believe that a successful woman was merely hysterical than to believe a charismatic man was a massive liar. They genuinely liked Gavin. He happily played golf with them. He laughed loudly at all their bad jokes. To them, he was a completely safe bet. Gavin smiled internally. He could visibly feel the entire room swaying heavily in his desired direction. He genuinely thought he had won the war. He foolishly thought the glass doors were securely locked and his fake narrative was entirely secure. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy successfully selling them a fake story of my total destruction, I was calmly standing in the elevator lobby, perfectly adjusting my designer blazer and checking my red lipstick in the reflection of the heavy glass doors. He was passionately talking about achieving corporate stability, but he was rapidly about to experience a massive earthquake. The double glass doors of the massive conference room did not slam open violently. They gracefully glided apart with a highly smooth, hydraulic hiss that instantly cut through the silence like a sharp blade. Gavin was entirely mid-sentence, his right hand raised in a dramatic gesture of mock solemnity, but his lying words instantly died in his throat. All 12 board members rapidly turned their heads, fully expecting to see a weeping, highly unhinged woman in a bathrobe, or perhaps building security forcefully dragging a hysterical wife away. Instead, they completely saw me. I was wearing a highly bespoke, immaculate white power suit that I had personally purchased in Milan, a remarkably stark, beautiful contrast to the highly somber, funeral-like tones of the stuffy room. My hair was styled to absolute perfection, and my makeup was completely flawless. There were absolutely no red, crying eyes. There was zero physical shaking. Right beside me, Miss Palmer walked with the grim, unyielding determination of a medieval executioner, carrying a massively thick leather binder that held the absolute, true weight of the entire meeting. I confidently walked into the room with the measured cadence of an apex predator actively entering its own territory. The silence was absolutely total. You could audibly hear the low hum of the air conditioning and the sharp, shocked intake of breath from Mr. Harrington, the powerful chairman of the board. Gavin instantly looked exactly like he had seen a ghost. His smug face drastically went from highly triumphant to completely terrified in the span of a single, agonizing heartbeat. "Arya," he stammered, his voice noticeably cracking. You shouldn't be here. You are incredibly unwell. Security! Someone call for security! I completely ignored him. I confidently walked to the exact opposite end of the incredibly long mahogany table, directly facing him. I smoothly pulled out the large, empty leather chair my father used to sit in and sat down with highly deliberate grace. Ms. Palmer heavily placed the incredibly thick binder directly in front of me with a loud thud that echoed exactly like a judge's gavel. "I am quite perfectly well, Gavin," I stated, my voice projecting clearly and effortlessly without needing a microphone. "In fact, I have honestly never been more entirely lucid. I clearly heard your passionate speech regarding corporate stability." It was genuinely very moving. However, there is one very small legal technicality you completely forgot to mention to these fine gentlemen. Mr. Harrington loudly cleared his throat, looking highly nervously between Gavin and me. "Arya, Gavin formally claims you are actively having a severe mental breakdown. He says you violently attacked him. If you are entirely mentally compromised, we absolutely cannot have you actively running this massive company." I smiled warmly at Mr. Harrington. A highly calculated smile that absolutely did not reach my eyes. "Gavin says a whole lot of things, but we are definitely not here today to actively discuss the state of my failed marriage or Gavin's entirely fictional version of my mental health. You all absolutely possess the power to actively vote to formally remove me as CEO. In fact, I highly encourage you to fully exercise your best judgment. If you honestly feel Gavin is the strong leader you truly need, then by all means, hand him the shiny title." Gavin blinked rapidly, looking highly confused. He fully expected a massive fight. He totally expected me to pathetically beg for my job, to aggressively scream about his disgusting affair, to violently drag our messy personal life onto the polished boardroom table. He absolutely didn't know how to properly handle my apparent surrender. But slowly continued, leaning forward slightly, letting my piercing gaze sweep across the entire room. "However, if you do officially fire me today, you deeply need to fully understand exactly what physically leaves this building with me. You see, when I initially started this massive company 5 entire years ago, long before I ever married Gavin, I was highly advised by my late grandmother to strictly protect my personal assets. Specifically, the incredibly valuable intellectual property." I tapped the heavy leather binder with a perfectly manicured fingernail. "The massive brand name, Lumina Lifestyle, the highly recognizable corporate logo, the extremely proprietary software algorithms we actively use for premium client matching, and most incredibly importantly, the entire massive architectural design portfolio, actively including the 3 massive upcoming Terra Green estates. These assets are absolutely not legally owned by this corporation. They are merely licensed to the corporation by me, personally, a specific license that is completely revocable entirely at will." I watched the color violently drain from Gavin's face. He knew absolutely nothing about complex business law, and he had obviously never once bothered to read the complex founding documents. "So please go right ahead," I said softly. "Vote, make Gavin the new CEO. But please know that if you actually do, he will officially be the CEO of a massive company that is rapidly about to entirely lose its name, its logo, and its entire product catalog in exactly 5 minutes." Ms. Palmer did not even wait for the loud murmurs of confusion to subside before she expertly delivered the fatal legal blow. She forcefully opened the thick leather binder with a deliberate, loud snap that sounded exactly like a gunshot in the highly quiet room. She smoothly slid a thick stack of documents entirely across the highly polished mahogany table directly toward Mr. Harrington, the chairman of the board. The papers were old. The edges were slightly yellowed with time, serving as a visual testament to their massive legal precedence. "Gentlemen," Ms. Palmer began, her voice projecting with the cool, unyielding authority of a federal judge. "You are currently operating under a highly fundamental, massive misunderstanding of this entire corporate structure. You strongly believe that Lumina Lifestyle, Incorporated physically owns the assets that actively generate 90% of your massive annual revenue. You strongly believe the company outright owns the blueprints, the brand identity, the logo, and the proprietary sustainability algorithms." She intentionally paused, letting her cold gaze drift slowly over every single board member before finally landing squarely on Gavin. "You are entirely mistaken. This corporation merely owns the office furniture, the employee computers, and the monthly lease on this specific building. Absolutely everything else, everything that actively makes this massive company highly valuable, is the sole, absolute personal property of Arya Hayes. Gavin let out a loud scoff that was half laugh, half joke. That is utterly ridiculous, he spat, aggressively leaning completely over the table. She specifically created those designs while actively working here. That legally makes them work for hire. They belong entirely to the company. That is basic business law 101. Arya, you absolutely cannot legally claim ownership of work you did while actively drawing a corporate salary. Ms. Palmer sharply adjusted her glasses and stared at Gavin with intense pity. Actually, Mr. Hayes, these specific copyrights and trademarks were legally filed 6 entire months before this company was ever formally incorporated. They were legally registered 1 full year before you even married my client. They are undeniably pre-existing personal assets. For the past 5 entire years, this massive company has been actively operating under a highly specific licensing agreement. A very, very generous agreement, I might add, which legally allowed the company to completely utilize Arya's intellectual property for a highly nominal fee of exactly $1 per year. I leaned forward, resting my elbows gracefully on the table and clasping my hands tightly. I watched the color rapidly drain from Mr. Harrington's face as he read the explicit clauses in the contract. He was a highly intelligent man. He realized instantaneously that the massive company was absolutely not an impenetrable castle. It was merely a flimsy tent pitched entirely in my own backyard. And as of 8:00 a.m. this morning, I stated, my voice incredibly steady and calm, I have officially exercised Clause 14 of that specific agreement. The license is entirely revocable at will by the licensor. I have completely revoked it. The entire room erupted into absolute chaos. Several powerful board members stood up violently, frantically shouting urgent questions all at once. Gavin looked exactly like he was going to be violently sick. What exactly does that mean? Mr. Harrington asked, his voice noticeably trembling. It means, I replied coolly, that if I physically walk out of these doors today without my formal position as CEO, this entire company ceases to legally exist as you currently know it. By noon today, you must legally strip the Lumina Lifestyle name entirely from this building. You must completely take down the massive website. You must instantly halt all construction on all 3 Terra Green estate projects, because you absolutely no longer possess the legal right to utilize my blueprints. You will simply be a massive construction company with 0 designs, absolutely no brand, and completely no future. I stood up slowly and gracefully smoothed out my crisp blazer. Gavin desperately wants to lead this massive company. Fine, let him lead it. But he will be actively leading a hollow shell corporation, possessing 0 valuable assets and a massive fleet of expensive trucks. He absolutely cannot afford to put gas in. The choice is entirely yours, gentlemen. You can certainly have your shiny new CEO, or you can actually have a profitable business. You absolutely cannot have both. The heavy silence that quickly followed was incredibly thick with the terrifying weight of millions of dollars actively evaporating into thin air. I saw the board members look directly at Gavin, not with respect, but with incredibly sudden and highly intense hostility. He had stupidly brought them right to the absolute edge of a massive cliff, and I had just expertly shown them exactly how incredibly deep the drop was. The hostile coup was officially over. The hostage negotiation had officially begun. The silence that aggressively followed my declaration was certainly not the silence of deep respect. It was the terrified silence of a massive bomb squad finally realizing the digital timer had just hit 0. 12 incredibly wealthy men stared at the documents Ms. Palmer had distributed, and then they frantically looked at their tablets, rapidly checking the company's current stock price, which was currently trading strongly at $45 a share. They knew with absolute certainty that the exact moment I walked out of that room and issued a formal press release, stating that Lumina Lifestyle no longer had the legal right to build its own designs, that specific stock would instantly be worth far less than the cheap paper it was printed on. Mr. Harrington was the very first to break the heavy paralysis. He aggressively turned to Gavin, his entire face flushing a deep, highly dangerous shade of purple. Gavin, is this actually true? He demanded, his voice trembling heavily with violently suppressed rage. Did you actually know about this massive licensing agreement? Did you actually know that the company absolutely does not own the actual intellectual property? Gavin stammered pathetically, aggressively wiping heavy sweat from his forehead with a violently shaking hand. I knew there was some paperwork, he mumbled weakly, but I truly thought it was just a legal formality. I completely thought once we formally got married, all her massive assets automatically became joint community property. I genuinely thought the company entirely absorbed everything. You thought, Mr. Harrington roared, violently slamming his heavy fist on the table, causing the crystal water pitcher to jump. You are the acting CEO, Gavin. It is entirely your specific job to actually know. You launched a highly hostile takeover of your own wife's massive company without even bothering to check if we actually own the physical product we are actively selling. You are literally telling me that we are rapidly about to lose the entire Terra Green Estates project. That is a massive $200 million contract, Gavin. Gavin desperately tried to rally. He stood up quickly, trying to actively regain his slight height advantage, but he suddenly looked incredibly small. She is entirely bluffing, he shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. She would never actually destroy her own company. She absolutely needs this massive money just as much as we do. She's just actively trying to scare us. Do not let her expertly manipulate you. We can easily fight this in court. We can legally claim implied consent. Ms. Palmer cleared her throat. It was a very soft sound, but it instantly cut through Gavin's loud shouting like a surgical knife. Actually, Mr. Hayes, she stated with absolute icy calm, we have already formally filed the official cease and desist orders. As of exactly this morning, absolutely any use of the Lumina lifestyle brand or the proprietary blueprints constitutes a highly willful copyright infringement. We will not just heavily sue the corporation. We will actively sue each and every individual board member personally for gross fiduciary negligence. That was the absolute tipping point. The terrifying concept of massive personal liability instant. TLY turned the entire board from a calm group of investors into a vicious pack of starving wolves. They absolutely didn't care about Gavin's failed marriage. They completely didn't care about his shiny leadership ambitions. They cared entirely about their own massive bank accounts. Another board member, a wealthy man named Mr. Sterling, who had casually played golf with Gavin every single Sunday for 3 years, violently stood up. You absolute idiot, he spat venomously at Gavin. You complete, incompetent fool. You dragged us all directly into this massive mess entirely because you couldn't manage to keep your pants zipped, and now you actually want us to pay for your messy divorce. You explicitly told us Arya was the massive liability. It highly looks like you are the exact one who is going to completely bankrupt us. The room utterly erupted. Wealthy men who had been happily nodding along to Gavin's passionate speech merely 10 minutes ago were now aggressively shouting over each other, violently demanding clear answers, aggressively demanding immediate resignations, and frantically distancing themselves entirely from him as fast as humanly possible. Gavin looked frantically around the room, finally realizing that his corporate allies were not genuine friends. They were vicious sharks, and he was heavily bleeding in the water. I sat comfortably back in my chair and peacefully watched the incredible carnage. I absolutely didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to argue. I had simply pulled a single loose thread and watched Gavin's entire custom suit completely unravel. He looked directly at me, his eyes pathetically pleading for mercy, silently begging me to stop the massive attack. But I just looked directly at him with the exact same freezing indifference he had so easily shown me when he happily slept with my sister. He desperately wanted to be the center of absolute attention. Now he fully was. The sheer chaos in the boardroom was actively reaching a fever pitch when a chair scraped incredibly loudly against the floor. It was a highly harsh, mechanical sound that silenced the screaming board members instantaneously. Declan slowly stood up at the far end of the incredibly long table. Throughout the entire chaotic meeting, he had remained totally silent, peacefully watching Gavin furiously dig his own massive grave with a completely stoic expression. Now, he casually adjusted his tie and smoothly buttoned his suit jacket with the incredibly slow, highly deliberate movements of a man who was fully about to deliver a painful eulogy. He didn't even look at me. He looked directly at Gavin. Mr. Harrington aggressively asked about the Terra Green Estates project, Declan stated, his voice incredibly deep and resonant, effortlessly filling the massive room without effort. He explicitly asked if we could somehow still build it entirely without the Lumina lifestyle brand. The absolute answer is no, but not just because of the missing blueprints. Gavin aggressively wiped heavy sweat from his upper lip. "Sit down, Declan," he snapped, desperately trying to regain some semblance of control. "This does absolutely not concern you. This is entirely a high-level shareholder matter." "Actually, Gavin, it concerns me deeply," Declan replied with chilling calmness. "Because as the lead architect and chief of design, I am the specific individual entirely responsible for executing those blueprints. And I personally have a strict moral clause actively embedded in my employment contract, too, one that I take very, very seriously." He reached smoothly into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a plain, standard white envelope. He slid it effortlessly down the extremely long mahogany table. It spun very slowly across the highly polished wood, eventually coming to a complete stop right directly in front of Mr. Harrington. "That is my formal, irrevocable letter of resignation," Declan stated firmly. "Effective immediately. I absolutely cannot in good conscience work for a CEO who achieved his massive position through gross deceit, nepotism, and the attempted, vicious destruction of the company's founder. I do not physically build houses for homewreckers." Gavin laughed incredibly nervously, frantically looking around the hostel room for any support. "Fine, leave," he scoffed loudly. "You are literally just one single architect, Declan. We can easily hire someone else tomorrow. There are literally plenty of people who would happily kill to work for Lumina Lifestyle. You are totally replaceable." Declan smiled. It was an incredibly cold, highly sharp smile that absolutely didn't reach his eyes. "I entirely expected you to say exactly that, Gavin, which is entirely why I took the absolute liberty of speaking deeply with my entire team this morning." He smoothly pulled out his smartphone and tapped the glowing screen, instantly projecting a massive document directly onto the smart wall positioned behind him. It was a high GHLY detailed list, a massively long, continuously scrolling list of printed names. "That is the formal resignation list of the entire senior design team," Declan announced, pointing directly at the massive screen. "The structural engineers, the landscape architects, the senior project managers, and the entire sustainability research division. They have all officially tendered their formal resignations, completely effective by noon today. They are absolutely not following a shiny title, Gavin. They are solely following Arya." The board members stared at the massive screen in absolute, unadulterated horror. They were actively watching the company's incredibly valuable talent pool rapidly drain away in real time. Without the IP, they absolutely had no product. Without the design team, they absolutely had no labor. Gavin wasn't the heroic captain of a slowly sinking ship anymore. He was merely the arrogant captain of a massive submarine that had the heavy hatch completely stuck open. Mr. Harrington looked intensely at the scrolling list and then directly at Gavin. His face was ghastly pale. "You lost the entire team," he whispered in shock. "You literally lost the entire department in one single morning." I sat comfortably back in my chair and peacefully watched the realization fully wash over Gavin. He had greedily wanted to entirely steal my company. He had desperately wanted to take my house, my money, and my reputation. But he totally forgot the absolute one thing you simply cannot steal. You absolutely cannot steal genuine loyalty. You actively have to earn it. And Gavin Hayes was chemically and biologically incapable of earning absolutely anything other than pure contempt. Ms. Palmer absolutely did not give Gavin a single moment to recover from the massive shock of completely losing the intellectual property. She simply turned a heavy page in her thick leather binder, the crisp, sharp sound echoing exactly like a gunshot in the deeply silent boardroom. While the wealthy board members were still aggressively murmuring about the highly disastrous loss of the Terra Green blueprints, she cleared her throat and addressed them directly with the chilling, clinical detachment of a seasoned surgeon. "Gentlemen," she stated, her voice slicing effortlessly through the noise. "While the sudden loss of the company's core assets is indeed a massive crisis, we must urgently address the immediate, dangerous liability currently sitting at the very head of this table. Mr. Hayes is currently under the completely false impression that even if he is formally removed today, he is legally entitled to a massive golden parachute." Gavin frantically straightened his tie, desperately trying to salvage a tiny shred of his remaining dignity. "That is entirely correct," he stated, his voice highly shaky but deeply defiant. "My specific contract clearly states that if I am ever terminated completely without cause, I am owed a massive severance package of $2 million, plus the highly accelerated vesting of all my stock options. You can easily fire me, Arya, but you will actively have to physically pay me to leave." I leaned comfortably back in my chair and smoothly crossed my legs. I watched him desperately cling to the pathetic hope of a massive payout, exactly like a drowning man desperately clutching a tiny piece of driftwood. It was almost sad to witness. "Actually, Gavin," I stated softly, "you are completely forgetting Clause 17, subsection B." Gavin frowned deeply. "What exactly are you talking about?" "The strict morality clause," Ms. Palmer announced loudly, reading directly from the legal document. "Acting executive may be formally terminated strictly for cause immediately, and completely without any financial compensation, if he actively engages in absolutely any conduct that directly brings public disrepute, massive scandal, or heavy ridicule to the entire corporation or its officers." Gavin laughed out loud, a highly harsh, barking sound that made everyone actively flinch. "Public disrepute," he mocked loudly. "This is a strictly private, highly personal family matter, Arya. Absolutely nobody outside of this specific room knows about what happened yesterday. You absolutely cannot legally use a highly private divorce to instantly trigger a massive public scandal clause. You are incredibly reaching." I calmly pulled my expensive tablet from my leather bag and tapped the dark screen to wake it up. I smoothly slid it entirely across the long mahogany table directly toward him. The bright glow of the screen heavily illuminated his extremely pale face. "Private," I repeated slowly. "Gavin, you clearly and severely underestimate the staggering speed of modern digital media. I took the absolute liberty of anonymously sending a highly detailed tip to the Seattle Business Journal this very morning, and it appears they have already fully run the massive story." Gavin stared at the bright tablet. The massive headline was incredibly bold, utterly brutal, and absolutely impossible to ignore. "Tech heiress evicts cheating CEO husband after catching him in bed with her sister." Right below the glaring headline was a slightly blurry, but entirely unmistakable digital photograph of Gavin awkwardly standing in my driveway, tightly wrapped in a flimsy white towel, heavily flanked by fully uniformed police officers. I watched his panicked eyes rapidly scan the dense article. It intricately detailed the formal police report, the massive emergency restraining order, and the incredibly sudden, shocking resignation of the entire senior design team. It absolutely wasn't just a news story. It was a total character assassination. The wealthy board members immediately pulled out their own smartphones. I clearly heard the highly collective, shocked gasps and loud mutters of pure disgust as they rapidly read the trending article. "This is completely trending on X right now," Mr. Sterling shouted, his entire face turning a deep, angry red. "People are already actively using the viral hashtag #EvictGavin." He looked directly at Gavin with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You are an absolute laughingstock. We absolutely cannot have a corporate CEO who is actively being memified for gross adultery. It actively makes the entire company look completely incompetent." Gavin rapidly looked up, his eyes wild with pure panic. "You intentionally did this," he whispered loudly, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at me. "You actively leaked this. You intentionally destroyed my reputation on purpose." I stood up very slowly, meticulously smoothing the crisp lapel of my white suit. "You entirely destroyed your own reputation the precise moment you decided to willingly sleep with my younger sister inside my own house, Gavin. I merely made sure the wealthy shareholders knew exactly who they were truly doing business with. And absolutely because of this highly viral article, your formal termination is officially classified as for cause. That legally means absolutely no $2 million, no vested stock options, no corporate health insurance. You officially leave this massive building with absolutely nothing." Mr. Harrington violently slammed his hand entirely on the table. "Enough!" he roared aggressively. "I formally call for an immediate vote to entirely terminate Gavin Hayes immediately under the strict morality clause. All in favor?" Every single hand in the entire room instantly shot up into the air. Gavin heavily slumped in his leather chair, utterly defeated by the very fine legal print he had never even bothered to read. He wasn't just formally fired. He was entirely erased. The formal vote was absolutely not a polite debate. It was a complete public execution. One by one, 12 hands raised firmly into the air. There was absolutely zero hesitation. There was zero pity. These men were ruthless capitalists, and they intimately knew that actively keeping Gavin Hayes fully employed was now a massive financial suicide mission. Mr. Harrington stared at the sea of raised hands and then firmly turned his gaze directly back to Gavin. "The formal motion carries entirely unanimously," he stated coldly. "You are completely relieved of all your operational duties, entirely effective immediately. Please immediately hand over your corporate security badge and your official company phone." Gavin stood completely frozen at the very head of the table. His small brain seemed entirely unable to physically process the sheer, brutal reality of the catastrophic situation. He looked desperately at Mr. Sterling, his former golf partner. He looked frantically at Mr. Davis, who had happily attended our expensive wedding. He was desperately searching for a supportive friend, but he only found incredibly hostile strangers who were solely worried about protecting their massive quarterly dividends. "This is a massive mistake," Gavin stammered loudly, his voice rapidly rising to an unhinged shout. "You are making a truly huge mistake. You absolutely cannot effectively run this massive company without me. I intimately know the massive operations. I intimately know all the clients. Arya hasn't physically been here in 6 whole months. She is highly rusty. She will actively drive this precious stock directly into the ground." Mr. Harrington absolutely did not bother to argue. He simply reached out and firmly pressed a tiny, hidden button located on the console directly in front of him. It was the highly silent security alarm that instantly summoned building corporate security. Gavin actively saw the subtle gesture and completely snapped. He violently slammed his hands down onto the highly polished mahogany table, aggressively leaning entirely over Mr. Harrington. "Do not you dare call building security on me," he screamed loudly, saliva literally flying from his open mouth. "I am the CEO. I personally built this entire quarter's massive strategy. I am the absolute Rhea. Son, you people are so incredibly rich. You absolutely cannot treat me like some pathetic, low-level employee caught actively stealing cheap office supplies." I sat completely perfectly still, peacefully watching him rapidly unravel. It was genuinely fascinating to witness how incredibly quickly the fake facade of the highly sophisticated executive entirely crumbled to perfectly reveal the petulant, screaming child hidden underneath. Gavin was absolutely not a leader. He was merely an incompetent actor who had entirely forgotten his lines. The double doors slid rapidly open once again. This specific time, it was absolutely not a sharp lawyer entering. It was the massive head of building security, an imposing man named Mason, who had previously been a massive linebacker in college. He was closely followed by 2 massive, uniformed guards. They absolutely did not look at Gavin with any fear or respect. They merely looked at him as a heavy liability that urgently needed to be physically removed. "Mr. Hayes," Mason stated calmly, stepping heavily forward, his voice incredibly deep and calm. "We need you to voluntarily come with us right now, sir." Gavin physically recoiled exactly as if he had been badly burned. "Do not even touch me," he hissed aggressively. "I am absolutely not going anywhere until I speak directly to my lawyer. This formal vote is entirely illegal. I will actively sue this entire board. I will aggressively burn this entire company to the absolute ground." Mr. Harrington rapidly stood up. His tiny shred of remaining patience had entirely evaporated. "You absolutely have no lawyer, Gavin, because you completely cannot afford one. And you are definitely not burning absolutely anything. You are actively trespassing. Mason, remove him." Gavin desperately tried to quickly dodge them. He actually attempted to physically run entirely around the massive table toward the secondary exit. It was an incredibly pathetic, highly undignified display. Mason easily caught him tightly by the arm with effortless, terrifying strength. Gavin violently thrashed around, loudly shouting vile profanities that actively echoed off the glass walls. The wealthy board members looked entirely away, deeply embarrassed to have ever willingly associated themselves with such a pathetic man. "Get your damn hands off me!" Gavin yelled incredibly loudly as they physically dragged him toward the exit. "I totally own this place, Arya. Tell them exactly who I am." I did absolutely not speak. I did not even look at him. I merely looked out at the stunning view of the massive city skyline, the booming city that I had actively helped build. As they forcefully hauled him through the wide open doors, I could easily see the shocked faces of the numerous employees gathered outside. They were tightly pressed against the glass of their small cubicles, actively recording absolutely everything on their smartphones. Gavin Hayes, the arrogant man who had proudly walked in that very morning falsely believing he was a king, was actively being dragged out exactly like an unruly, drunk patron at a cheap dive bar. The heavy doors slid firmly shut, completely cutting off his loud screams. The room instantly fell into a heavy, incredibly stunned silence. The fake king was dead. Long live the real queen. The rapid elevator ride down to the grand lobby was entirely a silent funeral procession for Gavin's massive ego. I peacefully took the private executive lift, while Mason and his massive security team forcefully stuffed Gavin into the cramped service elevator, which was usually strictly reserved for removing trash and taking large deliveries. When the heavy doors slid smoothly open on the ground floor, the massive, marble-clad lobby was already entirely transformed into a bustling amphitheater. Juicy corporate gossip travels far faster than the speed of light in a cutthroat environment, and virtually every single receptionist, male courier, and junior associate had magically found a totally fabricated reason to be standing right near the front security desk. They all desperately wanted to witness the dramatic fall of the arrogant tyrant, and Gavin absolutely did not disappoint them. He emerged highly forcefully, heavily flanked by the massive guards. His suit was deeply rumpled, and his entire face was a mottled, highly unattractive mix of deep red rage and extremely pale fear. He desperately tried to walk with some tiny semblance of remaining dignity, forcefully attempting to shake off Mason's iron grip, but he genuinely just looked exactly like a guilty prisoner, attempting to pretend he was an honored guest. He headed entirely straight for the massive glass revolving doors, incredibly desperate to quickly escape the intense, judging gaze of the very people he had actively terrorized for years. But I was exactly already there, standing perfectly still by the main security desk. "Stop him!" I commanded. My voice was definitely not overly Ood, but in the highly hushed acoustic perfection of the massive lobby, it cracked exactly like a sharp whip. Mason immediately stepped directly in front of Gavin, physically blocking his sole path to freedom. Gavin violently spun around, his eyes narrowing heavily into slits. "What exactly do you want now, Arya? You entirely fired me. You publicly humiliated me. Just let me leave." I walked very slowly toward him, deliberately stopping just inches outside of his striking distance. "You are absolutely leaving, Gavin, but you are actively leaving with exactly what you originally came into this marriage with, which is absolutely nothing." I calmly held out my hand, palm perfectly up. The phone, the laptop, the building key card, and the wallet containing the massive corporate American Express. Gavin tightly clutched his rumpled jacket. "This is entirely my personal phone," he argued loudly. "All my private contacts are on here. It is a company-issued smart device entirely paid for by the IT budget." I quickly corrected him without blinking. "Hand it entirely over right now. Or do we actively need to formally call the police for grand theft of corporate property, too? I truly think you have had more than enough interaction with active law enforcement for one single week." Gavin looked frantically at the massive guards, and then at the entirely silent, judging crowd of active employees. He knew deeply he was entirely beaten. With violently trembling hands, he reached deeply into his pocket. He aggressively slammed the phone directly into my open hand. Then he roughly unslung the heavy laptop bag from his shoulder and violently dropped it directly at my designer feet. Finally, he forcefully threw the thick wallet right onto the main reception desk. "There," he spat venomously. "Are you entirely happy now?" "Not quite," I stated smoothly, pointing directly through the massive glass walls to the highly reserved VIP parking spot located right in front of the main entrance. "The keys to the black Porsche, Gavin." Gavin's jaw completely dropped. "You absolutely cannot take the car. How am I supposed to physically get home?" I shrugged highly indifferently. "I frequently hear the public bus system is truly excellent, or you can simply walk. It is only 12 total miles to your mother's house. Consider it an excellent time to deeply reflect on your terrible life choices." He stood there entirely paralyzed. The expensive Porsche was the absolute last physical symbol of his massive status, the very last thing that actually made him feel like a man of high importance. Actively giving up those shiny keys was exactly like permanently giving up his core identity. Mason stepped heavily forward, looming terrifyingly over him. "The keys, sir." Gavin reached slowly into his pocket and fished out the heavy, expensive fob. He absolutely did not hand it to me directly. He violently threw it entirely across the massive lobby floor. It loudly skidded across the highly polished marble, eventually coming to a complete rest directly near the janitor's cart. "Get him entirely out of here," I commanded, smoothly turning my back on him. Mason and the heavy guards forcefully grabbed Gavin by the upper arms. He absolutely didn't even try to fight them this time. He just went entirely limp, utterly defeated. They aggressively marched him directly to the glass revolving doors and shoved him entirely through. He stumbled awkwardly out onto the incredibly harsh concrete sidewalk, blinking rapidly in the extremely bright daylight. It was a perfectly identical mirror image of the exact scene at my estate. First, he permanently lost the massive home he absolutely didn't own. Now, he completely lost the massive company he entirely didn't build. He was securely back right on the street, exactly where he truly belonged. You would honestly think that being highly publicly evicted and entirely fired in the short span of exactly 24 hours would actively teach a highly arrogant man some deep humility. But for someone like Gavin Hayes, hitting absolute rock bottom was simply a solid foundation to actively build a brand new tower of massive delusion. He entirely didn't physically leave Seattle. He absolutely didn't retreat to his mother's house to deeply reflect on his massive failures. Instead, he went completely straight to a highly sleazy strip mall law firm located on the absolute outskirts of the city and formally filed a massive lawsuit that was absolutely breathless in its sheer audacity. Exactly 3 entire days after the massive boardroom coup, I sat peacefully in my home office, quietly reading the incredibly thick stack of legal papers that a smarmy process server had aggressively slapped directly into my hand while I was at the upscale grocery store. It was a highly formal, incredibly aggressive complaint formally filed in the Superior Court of Washington. The primary plaintiffs were listed as Gavin Hayes and, incredibly strangely, Brianna, who was actively listed as an intervening party, officially claiming massive emotional distress. But the absolute core of the massive lawsuit was entirely financial. Gavin was aggressively suing for exactly 50% of all marital assets accumulated during our 5-year union. His sleazy lawyer, a greasy man named Silas, who heavily advertised on extremely late-night television, had clearly entirely convinced him that Washington's strict community property laws were his absolute golden ticket to massive wealth. The legal logic was incredibly simple, and on the surface, entirely legally sound. Since we absolutely did not possess a formal prenuptial agreement regarding specific cash savings, Gavin entirely believed that every single dollar I personally earned while acting as the highly successful CEO was strictly joint property. I could almost audibly hear Gavin's arrogant voice embedded in the dense legal jargon. He falsely claimed that I was actively hiding massive assets. He wildly claimed that the company's incredibly high valuation was partially due directly to his leadership. He wildly estimated our fully liquid, joint assets to be entirely in the massive range of $10 to $15 million. He actively wanted exactly half. He desperately wanted $5 million in pure cash immediately, plus ongoing massive alimony to effectively maintain the high-end lifestyle to which he had become so heavily accustomed. Brianna had also actively added her own ridiculous demands. She was formally claiming that by actively evicting her completely without proper notice, I had aggressively caused her highly severe psychological trauma and permanently damaged her delicate social reputation. She actively wanted massive financial compensation for pain and suffering. It was an absolute masterclass in massive entitlement. They genuinely, truly believed that simply because I was incredibly rich, they were entirely entitled to a massive severance package solely for viciously betraying me. I calmly picked up my phone and directly called Ms. Palmer. She immediately answered on the very first ring. "I entirely assume you have already read the massive filing," she stated, her tone incredibly dry. "I have indeed," I replied, slowly flipping to the specific page where Gavin violently demanded full access to my completely non-existent offshore accounts. He actually thinks I have massive millions sitting quietly in the Cayman Islands. He is incredibly desperate, Ms. Palmer observed. He is entirely maxed out on all his personal credit cards, and he urgently needs a massive win. He is heavily banking on you quickly settling completely out of court just to heavily avoid the negative publicity. He honestly thinks you will just quietly write him a massive check for $1 million simply to make him permanently go away. I looked peacefully out the window at the soft rain gently falling on my expansive garden. $1 million. It was a massive amount of money to most regular people. To a man like Gavin, it was the absolute difference between actually having to work for a real living and successfully continuing his massive life of endless leisure. "Set up the formal deposition," I commanded. "Are you entirely sure?" Ms. Palmer asked cautiously. "We can very easily file a formal motion to entirely dismiss based primarily on his documented infidelity." "No," I stated firmly. "An immediate dismissal is entirely too quick. He desperately needs to physically see the real numbers. He entirely thinks I am comfortably sitting on a massive mountain of cash. I deeply want to look him completely in the eye when he finally finds out exactly what is actually sitting in those accounts. Schedule a formal mediation session. Tell them I am completely ready to fully divide the marital assets." I peacefully hung up the phone. Gavin aggressively wanted exactly half. He wanted a completely fair division of absolutely everything we built together. I decided right then and there to generously give him exactly what he aggressively asked for. He was so incredibly focused entirely on the massive assets, he totally forgot that an active marriage is also an equal partnership in massive liability. He eagerly wanted to perfectly split the entire pie, but he completely didn't realize the massive pie was entirely poisoned. The massive mediation room at Palmer and Associates was expertly designed to physically intimidate. It was essentially a massive glass box entirely suspended 40 floors high above the bustling city, completely filled with highly expensive black leather chairs, and a conference table so incredibly polished, it flawlessly reflected the massive greed on the flushed faces of the very people sitting directly across from me. The thick atmosphere was definitely not one of peaceful reconciliation, but of a hostile shakedown. Gavin sat nervously on the left, wearing a cheap suit that was very clearly bought right off the rack, anxiously fidgeting with a cheap, plastic ballpoint pen. Brianna sat incredibly close to him, looking exactly like the highly smug cat who had not only entirely eaten the prized canary, but was now aggressively demanding a dessert. But the absolutely most infuriating presence in the entire room was my own mother. Priscilla had aggressively insisted on actively attending, falsely claiming she was merely there as neutral moral support. In absolute reality, she was entirely there to actively ensure the massive wire transfer actually went through. She sat exactly between the two cheaters and me, her face firmly set in a highly dramatic mask of long-suffering matriarchal concern. "Arya, please," she began, her voice loudly echoing in the sterile room. "Let us absolutely not drag this out. Just look at your sister. Just look at Gavin. They currently have absolutely nothing. You have absolutely everything. Is it really so incredibly hard to show just a little tiny bit of mercy?" I stared intensely at her. "Mercy," I repeated coldly. "Yes, mercy," Priscilla aggressively insisted. "Brianna deeply needs a completely fresh start. She is incredibly young. She merely made a mistake. But you absolutely cannot expect her to actively rebuild her entire life with zero resources. You urgently need to generously give her a massive nest egg, a nice condo in Bellevue, a highly reliable luxury car, and a massive monthly stipend until she officially gets back on her feet. It is literally the very least you can possibly do as her older sister." Brianna actively smirked. It was an incredibly subtle movement, just a tiny twitch of the corner of her highly glossed mouth, but I absolutely saw it. She leaned casually back in the expensive leather chair, confidently crossing her arms. "Mom is entirely right, Arya," she stated, her voice dripping heavily with massive entitlement. "You have massive millions just sitting in the bank. You genuinely won't even miss it. I just strictly want what is totally fair. I suffered massive emotional distress, too. You know, being forcefully kicked out on the street completely barefoot was highly traumatic." Gavin's sleazy lawyer, the greasy man named Silas, who smelled very faintly of cheap tobacco and deep desperation, loudly cleared his throat. He smoothly opened a highly thin file folder. "Let us strictly stick to the actual numbers," Silas began. "My client formally asserts that under Washington state law, exactly 50% of all liquid assets formally accumulated during the entire marriage completely belong to him. Based heavily on Lumina Lifestyle's massive revenue reports from the last 5 entire years, we conservatively estimate the massive marital estate to be worth approximately $12 million. Therefore, we are formally asking for an immediate lump sum payment of exactly $6 million to Mr. Hayes." Gavin stared directly at me, his eyes practically shining with pure, unadulterated avarice. $6 million. He had practically already spent the entire sum in his small head. He was already vividly picturing the massive new luxury apartment, the shiny new sports car, the incredibly expensive vacations he would immediately take with my sister. He aggressively tapped the glass table with his index finger. "And I absolutely want the expensive jewelry returned," he added quickly. "The gold Rolex, the custom cufflinks, those were completely gifts. You absolutely cannot legally keep personal gifts, Arya." I sat absolutely perfectly still, my hands resting folded gently in my lap. I peacefully watched them mentally construct their massive castle entirely in the clouds. They genuinely, truly believed that massive top-line revenue instantly equaled massive personal profit. They entirely believed that simply because I actively lived a massive life of absolute luxury, I possessed a massive hidden vault entirely full of gold coins, exactly like a cartoon dragon. They had never once, in 5 entire years, actually asked to review the boring balance sheets. They just arrogantly assumed the massive money was always there, because I constantly made sure the massive bills were always paid. Ms. Palmer sharply adjusted her designer glasses and stared at Silas with an apex predator's quiet patience. She calmly reached entirely under the glass table and pulled out an incredibly heavy banker's box. She absolutely did not place a shiny check on the table. She forcefully placed a massively thick stack of heavy financial ledgers that hit the wood with a heavy, highly ominous thud. "We are perfectly, entirely happy to fully divide the community property," Ms. Palmer stated, her voice utterly devoid of any emotion. "In fact, Arya strictly insists upon it. A completely complete and total 50-50 split of absolutely all assets and all massive liabilities officially accumulated during the marriage." Gavin smiled incredibly brightly. "Great. Just cut the damn check." I finally smiled brightly back. It was exactly the sharp smile of a steel trap actively snappy. "NG shut." "Oh, Gavin," I stated softly. "There is absolutely no check, but there is a calculator. I truly hope you brought one. You are deeply going to need it." Gavin leaned aggressively forward, heavily resting his elbows on the highly polished glass table, his eyes shining incredibly bright with the toxic fever of easy money. He had aggressively spent the absolute last 20 minutes forcefully lecturing the entire room on the massive valuation of my own company. Rapidly reciting numbers he had merely skimmed from highly public press releases and internal quarterly newsletters. He confidently looked at his greasy lawyer, Silas, and then directly back at me with a massive smirk that aggressively suggested he had totally already won the massive lottery. "Let us be entirely real here, Arya," Gavin stated, his voice dripping heavily with massive condescension. "I deeply know the actual numbers. I was literally the CEO, remember? The massive waterfront lofts project easily brought in $3 million in pure revenue last year. The Terra Green Estate's massive pre-sales easily topped $4 million, and the highly lucrative licensing deals for the smart home technology effortlessly generated another $3 million easily." He held up both of his hands, his fingers violently splayed as if he were physically holding the massive stacks of cash. "That is an easy $10 million in pure liquid assets just quietly sitting in the corporate operating accounts. And that is a highly conservative estimate. I am absolutely not even counting the massive real estate portfolio or the offshore tax holdings I actively know you hide. You perpetually like to keep a massive financial safety net. Well, now that massive net is legally community property.